Tonight, we're diving into the true story of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and into the one simple, persistent misunderstanding that has followed them across the whole of their long history: the word witch, spoken so often by frightened outsiders who never understood what they were actually looking at. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here that can reach you. Only a slow and even voice moving carefully through centuries of discipline, patience, and quiet, deliberate design. If these long, quiet tellings are the ones that finally carry you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night. And that is the only small thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will follow, without haste, exactly what the sisterhood actually is beneath the fear and the legend, the training that shaped them, the memory they carried, and the long, patient plan that quietly guided the whole of the Imperium for longer than most of its own rulers ever realized. You do not need to hold on to any of it, and none of it can touch you where you are. Let it move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down toward rest. Across the whole of the known Imperium, on countless worlds shaped by superstition and by the ordinary human fear of what cannot be easily explained, the members of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood were called, again and again, by a single word that never once accurately described them: witches. Fremen elders whispered it. Nobles at the Landsraad Council used it with careful, uneasy respect. Even the Emperor's own court, for all its formal education and formal sophistication, occasionally reached for the same simple, frightened label whenever a Bene Gesserit sister did something that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Tonight, we are going to take that word apart carefully and set it aside, because it was always the wrong word, applied by people who understood only the surface of what they were looking at. A witch, in the oldest sense the word still carries from old Earth folklore, is someone who commands forces outside the natural order, someone whose power comes from somewhere unexplained and possibly forbidden, magic granted rather than earned. Nothing about the Bene Gesserit matches this description, however convenient the label might have felt to frightened observers standing outside their order. Every single capability a Bene Gesserit sister possessed, every uncanny skill that made ordinary people flinch and reach for older, superstitious words, was earned through decades of documented, disciplined, entirely physical, and entirely mental training, beginning in early childhood and continuing without pause for the whole of a sister's working life. Consider the voice, perhaps the single ability most responsible for the witch label sticking so persistently across so many centuries. A trained sister could shape her own tone, pitch, and rhythm with such precision that another person's body would respond to a spoken command before their conscious mind had any chance to evaluate or resist it. To someone standing outside the sisterhood's training halls, watching a hardened guard drop his weapon at a single quiet word, this looked exactly like magic. It was not magic. It was applied physiology, a mastery of the human nervous system's own predictable, exploitable responses to sound, refined across generations of careful Bene Gesserit study and practice, until it became reliable enough to use in the field, under real pressure, against real resistance. The same held true for every other capability the sisterhood cultivated. Their ability to detect a lie by reading the smallest involuntary shift in a person's pulse, breath, and muscle tension was not mystical insight, but trained, exhaustive observation. The product of years spent learning to notice signals ordinary human attention simply glosses over. Their extraordinary physical control, capable of altering their own body chemistry, suppressing pain, or surviving conditions that would incapacitate an untrained person entirely, came from prana bindu discipline. A comprehensive system of body and mind training this history will examine in considerably more detail in the chapter immediately following this one. None of it arrived as a gift. All of it was built, deliberately and painstakingly, one exercise and one lesson at a time, across years that began, for most sisters, before they were old enough to fully understand what they were being trained to eventually become. It is worth asking, before this history moves any further into the specific details of Bene Gesserit training and Bene Gesserit purpose, why the witch label persisted so stubbornly across so many centuries and so many different cultures within the Imperium, despite how little it actually described. Part of the answer lies simply in how the sisterhood chose to present itself. Bene Gesserit doctrine actively cultivated an aura of mystery around its methods, understanding correctly that unexplained capability generates more caution and more useful fear than capability whose mechanism has been carefully explained and therefore demystified. A guard who believes a sister commands supernatural power will hesitate longer and resist less effectively than a guard who understands her voice as simply an unusually well-trained application of ordinary human physiology. This deliberate cultivation of mystery served the sisterhood's own larger political purposes throughout their long history. Purposes this account will trace in considerable depth across the chapters ahead. Purposes involving careful, patient influence exercised across noble houses, entire planetary populations, and eventually the whole trajectory of human civilization's long-term survival. Understanding the Bene Gesserit accurately, seeing past the witch label to the actual, disciplined institution underneath it, requires setting aside the easy, frightened shorthand outsiders reached for, and looking instead at exactly what the sisterhood built, generation after patient generation, through nothing more mysterious than extraordinary human effort applied with extraordinary consistency, across an extraordinarily long span of time. Consider, too, how differently the sisterhood might be remembered had they chosen a different relationship with public perception entirely, actively explaining their methods rather than cultivating mystery around them. Some later Bene Gesserit scholars, writing after the sisterhood's own transformation during the war against the honored atreides, have argued that this deliberate cultivation of unexplained mystery ultimately cost the order more than it ever gained them, breeding exactly the kind of fear and suspicion that made the sisterhood's own genuine, considerable contributions to imperial stability and imperial governance harder for ordinary people to fully appreciate or fully trust across the whole of their long institutional history. The Fremen in particular carried their own complicated relationship with the word witch and its Bene Gesserit associations, since the Missionaria Protectiva's own careful seeding of religious prophecy among their ancestors, a topic this history will examine in considerable detail in a later chapter, meant that Fremen culture had absorbed genuine Bene Gesserit influence directly into their own most sacred religious tradition without ever fully understanding the true, calculated origin of the beliefs they held so sincerely and so deeply. The wider Imperium's fascination with the witch label persisted even among educated nobles who, by rights, should have understood Bene Gesserit method well enough to reject the term entirely, a testament to how deeply ingrained the fear and mystery surrounding the sisterhood had become across generations of careful, deliberate cultivation, and how difficult it proved for even sophisticated observers to fully separate genuine understanding from the emotional weight of centuries of accumulated legend and accumulated superstition surrounding an order that had, quite deliberately, never worked especially hard to correct the misunderstanding. Later Bene Gesserit historians, writing after the sisterhood's own dramatic transformation during their war against the honored atreides, would look back on this long-standing witch mythology with a certain rueful recognition, acknowledging that the sisterhood's own choices had shaped much of the misunderstanding that later generations, including this very telling tonight, have worked to carefully unravel and correct. Understanding the Bene Gesserit accurately matters for reasons beyond simple historical correction, since the witch label, however comfortable and however familiar, actively obscures the genuine, sobering lessons their real history has to offer regarding discipline, patience, and the genuine, considerable power ordinary human effort, sustained across generations, can eventually accumulate without requiring any supernatural explanation whatsoever. Consider, before we move any further into the specifics of this remarkable order's training and history, exactly how much easier it always is to reach for the word witch than to sit patiently with the more complicated, more genuinely human truth underneath it. A pattern this history suspects extends considerably beyond the Bene Gesserit alone into how frightened people across every era of history have generally chosen to explain capability they simply had not taken the time to properly understand. The sisterhood merely offers us, tonight, one particularly well-documented and particularly consequential example of that same old, familiar human habit playing out across an entire civilization's long, complicated relationship with a group of women who had simply worked harder and more patiently than almost anyone else around them. With that framing settled clearly in mind, let us finally, properly begin, starting exactly where the sisterhood itself always began, with a very young child and a very demanding education, patiently applied. Later sisters who examined the earliest surviving accounts of this founding period noted something easy to miss on a first reading, that the women who built these original structures were not visionaries operating from certainty, but pragmatists operating from necessity, assembling whatever tools proved reliably useful and discarding, often ruthlessly, whatever did not survive honest testing across repeated, careful trial. That willingness to discard even cherished early methods when evidence no longer supported them became, in its own quiet way, as defining a sisterhood trait as any single technique the order eventually mastered and taught forward across the many centuries that followed. Up next in Chapter 2, Born into the Order, we'll uncover exactly how a Bene Gesserit sisters training actually began, and just how young that training truly started. Girls entered Bene Gesserit training at an age when most children elsewhere in the Imperium were still learning to read. Some brought to the sisterhood schools by families who had long-standing arrangements with the order. Others selected through more careful, deliberate genetic screening connected to the wider breeding program this history will examine in a later chapter. Whatever the specific path that brought them there, the training that followed was total, structured, and unrelenting, shaping a child's body and a child's mind so thoroughly that by adulthood, very little remained of who they might have become without it. The earliest years of training focused heavily on physical discipline, teaching young students to observe and eventually control involuntary bodily processes most people never learn to notice at all. Their own heart rate, their own breathing, the small, automatic tensions that ordinary bodies carry without conscious awareness. This early physical training served as the foundation for everything that followed, since a sister who could not first master her own body's basic, automatic responses would never reliably master the more advanced techniques. The voice, the truth reading, the precise physical combat forms that depended entirely on that same foundational bodily awareness and control. Alongside physical discipline, young Bene Gesserit students received an education in history, politics, genetics, and psychology considerably more rigorous and considerably more comprehensive than almost any other institution within the Imperium offered its own students, noble or common alike. This intellectual training equipped sisters to serve as genuinely sophisticated political advisors and analysts once their formal education concluded. A role many sisters filled quietly within noble households across the Imperium, offering counsel that appeared, to outside observers, remarkably prescient, though it in fact drew on nothing more mysterious than unusually thorough training in reading political and historical pattern. The emotional and psychological demands placed on young students proved, by every surviving account, at least as significant as the physical and intellectual demands, since Bene Gesserit doctrine required sisters to master their own fear, their own attachment, and their own instinctive emotional reactions with the same rigor applied to physical discipline. Young students who struggled with this particular dimension of training, however capable they proved in other areas, sometimes found themselves redirected toward different roles within the wider sisterhood structure, since the full range of Bene Gesserit capability required an emotional discipline not every student, however intelligent or however physically gifted, ultimately proved able to sustain. The particular relationship between individual students and their instructors, senior sisters, who had themselves once passed through this same demanding education decades or centuries earlier, carried its own careful, considered structure. Instructors trained specifically to recognize and cultivate each student's particular strengths while identifying, early and honestly, areas requiring additional focused attention. This individualized approach, remarkable given the scale and consistency of Bene Gesserit training across the whole of the Imperium, reflected the sisterhood's own genuine investment in producing sisters capable of fulfilling whatever specific role the Order's larger, patient planning eventually required of them. By the time a young Bene Gesserit student reached full adulthood, having spent the whole of her childhood and adolescence inside this comprehensive, demanding education, she had become something categorically different from an ordinary product of any other educational system within the Imperium. A person whose body, mind, and emotional discipline had been shaped with the same careful, deliberate intention the sisterhood brought to every other aspect of its long-term institutional planning. The physical spaces where this training occurred, sisterhood schools maintained across various worlds throughout the Imperium, developed their own particular architecture and their own particular atmosphere, suited to the demanding, disciplined life conducted within their walls. Spare and functional rather than ornate, reflecting the sisterhood's own broader institutional preference for substance over display in nearly every dimension of their careful, patient work. Not every young student who entered Bene Gesserit training ultimately completed the full course of instruction, and the sisterhood maintained careful, honest evaluation throughout the process, redirecting students whose particular capabilities suited them better towards specific specialized roles rather than the broader, more demanding path toward full sisterhood membership. A practical acknowledgement that even within an institution built around extraordinary human discipline, genuine individual variation in capability and genuine individual variation in temperament required flexible, honest accommodation rather than any rigid insistence that every student follow an identical path toward an identical outcome. Discipline within Bene Gesserit schools extended into every dimension of daily student life, including careful attention to diet, sleep, and physical routine, reflecting the sisterhood's own broader conviction that genuine mental and physical mastery required attention to even the smallest, most seemingly mundane details of a student's ordinary existence. A comprehensive approach to education that few other institutions across the Imperium attempted to match in either scope or in consistency across so many years of sustained, careful instruction. Sisters who eventually rose to positions of genuine institutional authority within the sisterhood itself, becoming instructors or senior administrators rather than serving primarily in external political or diplomatic roles. often reflected that their own understanding of the training they had once received only fully matured once they themselves began teaching it to a new generation of young students, a pattern of deepening understanding through instruction that the sisterhood's own institutional culture actively encouraged and actively valued across the whole of their long educational tradition. And so, year after careful year, an ordinary child slowly became something the wider Imperium would eventually learn to fear, respect, and profoundly misunderstand. Consider what it actually meant, in practical terms, for a child to spend her entire early life inside this kind of total educational environment, every waking hour shaped deliberately toward a single, larger institutional purpose. And consider, too, how differently such a childhood must have felt from the inside, compared to how coolly and how clinically outside observers, reaching for the word witch, generally imagined the sisterhood's methods to actually be. There is real tenderness worth noticing here, too, buried beneath all the discipline and all the calculation this history has otherwise emphasized. Individual instructors who genuinely cared for the specific, particular child in front of them. Patient guidance offered across years by women who understood, from their own long-ago childhoods, exactly how demanding and exactly how disorienting this particular path could feel from the inside. However calmly and however confidently the finished product eventually came to carry herself once her own training was finally complete. Every reverend mother who ever guided a young student through this demanding process had, once, been exactly that same frightened, uncertain child herself, a continuity of shared experience that ran quietly beneath the sisterhood's more formal, more disciplined public presentation. Instructors overseeing this early training understood, from their own considerable accumulated experience, that pushing a student too quickly toward outward composure before the underlying discipline had genuinely taken root tended to produce only a fragile, performative calm that collapsed instantly under real pressure rather than the durable, load-bearing steadiness the sisterhood actually required of its trained members. For this reason, training moved deliberately slowly during these earliest years, prioritizing genuine internal transformation over any outward appearance of progress that visiting observers or impatient noble sponsors might otherwise have preferred to see demonstrated sooner. Up next in Chapter 3, Prana Bindu and Total Mastery of the Body, we'll uncover the specific physical discipline underlying nearly every capability the wider Imperium mistook for genuine magic. Prana Bindu discipline formed the physical foundation underlying nearly every capability that made the Bene Gesserit appear, to outside observers, to command forces beyond ordinary human explanation. The term itself referred to a comprehensive system of nerve and muscle training, developed and refined across centuries of sisterhood practice, that allowed a sufficiently trained practitioner to exercise conscious control over bodily processes most people never learn to influence at all, from heart rate and blood flow to the precise individual firing of specific muscle groups, usually governed entirely by unconscious reflex. The practical applications of this training extended across nearly every dimension of Bene Gesserit capability. A sister trained in Prana Bindu could slow her own heartbeat and metabolism dramatically, allowing her to survive conditions, extreme cold, limited oxygen, prolonged physical strain, that would quickly incapacitate an untrained person. She could direct blood flow away from a wound with enough precision to significantly slow bleeding through conscious physiological control alone, without any medical intervention beyond her own trained will. She could move with a speed and precision in physical combat that appeared, to opponents trained in more conventional fighting styles, almost impossibly fluid, since her own body's response time had been refined through years of training to eliminate nearly every trace of the ordinary hesitation and inefficiency present in untrained physical movement. This same foundational discipline underlay the sisterhood's famous physical resilience and physical endurance, capabilities that contributed enormously to the witch reputation that followed Bene Gesserit's sisters across the whole of the Imperium. A sister who could walk for days across harsh terrain without the physical breakdown an untrained person would experience, or who could recover from injury with unusual speed through conscious physiological management, appeared to observers unfamiliar with prana bindu training to possess some genuinely supernatural constitution. In reality, she simply possessed a level of conscious bodily control that took years of dedicated training to develop, and that remained, throughout Bene Gesserit history, entirely available in principle to anyone willing and able to complete the same demanding education. The training methods used to develop prana bindu mastery combined careful, incremental physical exercise with equally careful mental discipline, since the entire system depended on a practitioner's ability to maintain precise conscious attention on bodily processes that ordinary awareness typically ignores entirely. Early training exercises often began with simple tasks, learning to consciously slow or quicken one's own pulse through breath control and mental focus, before gradually progressing toward considerably more sophisticated applications requiring simultaneous control over multiple bodily systems at once. A progression that could take many years to fully master even among the sisterhood's most naturally gifted students. Bene Gesserit instructors emphasized throughout this training that prana bindu mastery, however impressive its eventual applications, remained fundamentally a discipline of patience and incremental progress rather than any sudden, dramatic breakthrough. A lesson that shaped the wider sisterhood culture's general emphasis on long-term, patient effort over quick, easy results across nearly every other dimension of their institutional practice and their institutional planning as well. The physical combat applications of prana bindu training, sometimes referred to informally as the weirding way in less formal sisterhood usage, combined this precise bodily control with detailed anatomical knowledge, allowing a trained sister to identify and exploit an opponent's physical vulnerabilities with a precision that made even brief physical confrontations against Bene Gesserit sisters extraordinarily dangerous for untrained opponents, regardless of how much larger or how much more conventionally strong those opponents might otherwise have been. Bene Gesserit medical knowledge, closely connected to their prana bindu mastery, extended into genuinely sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology, knowledge that made trained sisters valuable as healers and as advisors on matters of health and medicine across noble households throughout the Imperium, a practical, everyday application of their training that generated considerably less fear and considerably more straightforward gratitude than their more dramatic combat and persuasion capabilities typically produced among people who encountered them. The internal, subjective experience of prana bindu mastery, described in fragments across various surviving sisterhood writings and testimonies, involved a genuinely unusual relationship with one's own body, a sister's conscious awareness extending into physiological processes most people never think about at all, creating a sense of total, integrated self-command that practitioners across the sisterhood's long history consistently described as one of the most genuinely transformative aspects of their entire training. Considerably more significant to their own private sense of identity than the more outwardly dramatic capabilities this mastery eventually made possible. Advanced prana bindu practitioners eventually developed the capacity to consciously alter their own outward appearance in subtle but genuinely useful ways, adjusting posture, muscle tension, and even certain aspects of facial expression with enough precision to shift how observers perceive their age, their mood, or their general demeanor, a capability that proved valuable in diplomatic and intelligence contexts, where a sister's ability to present a carefully calibrated impression, rather than simply her unmodified natural bearing, offered genuine practical advantage across countless different political and social situations throughout the Imperium. The considerable physical toll of maintaining prana bindu discipline across an entire lifetime should not be understated within this history, since sustained conscious control over bodily processes that ordinary people leave entirely to unconscious regulation required continuous mental effort even for the most experienced practitioners. A discipline some aging sisters described as growing genuinely more demanding rather than more automatic across their later years, contrary to what a simpler understanding of mastered skill might otherwise predict. The sisterhood's own internal instructors described prana bindu mastery not as a destination ever fully reached, but as a lifelong practice continuously refined. Each sister's own particular relationship with her body deepening across decades of continued attention in ways that made even the most senior, most accomplished practitioners describe themselves as still, in some sense, students of their own physical discipline. This framing, treating even extraordinary mastery as simply another stage of ongoing practice rather than any final achievement, reflects the same patient, humble institutional culture running through nearly every other dimension of Bene Gesserit training this history has traced across the whole of tonight's telling. It is worth remembering, as this history continues moving through each new capability the sisterhood developed across their long institutional history, that every single one of them traces back to this same foundational physical discipline, prana bindu, serving as the quiet, unglamorous root beneath nearly every more dramatic, more visible Bene Gesserit skill that would eventually earn the sisterhood their considerable, if fundamentally misplaced, reputation for possessing genuine supernatural power. There is a quiet lesson worth taking from this particular chapter of our telling tonight, one that extends well beyond the sisterhood itself, that the body, given enough patient, careful attention, holds far more capability within it than most of us, moving carelessly through our own ordinary days, ever pause long enough to actually discover. The Bene Gesserit simply chose to pause, deliberately and for a very long time, and looked more closely than almost anyone else in the whole of the Imperium ever thought to. That patient, sustained looking, more than any single dramatic breakthrough, is the true origin of nearly everything this history has traced so far, and nearly everything still left to trace across the remaining chapters still ahead of us tonight. This patient, sustained looking extended even to failure, since the sisterhood's own internal records treated a mistaken observation not as an embarrassment to be quietly buried, but as data worth preserving and studying alongside every successful one. A discipline that required considerable institutional humility from an order otherwise known, fairly or not, for its formidable confidence. Reviewing centuries of accumulated observation this way, later generations of sisters could refine their own prana bindu, training against a genuinely enormous body of prior recorded experience, rather than relying solely on whatever any single instructor happened to have personally witnessed across her own individual career. This same principle, that mastery comes from patient, sustained attention rather than any single dramatic breakthrough, would echo throughout nearly every other capability this history still has left to trace tonight. A quiet thread running underneath the sisterhood's entire approach to training its own members across every discipline it ever developed. Up next in Chapter 4, The Voice That Cannot Be Disobeyed, will uncover exactly how the Bene Gesserit developed and applied their most feared and most misunderstood capability. Of every capability the Bene Gesserit sisterhood developed across their long history, none contributed more directly to their fearsome, mysterious reputation than the voice. A trained ability to shape spoken command with such precise control over tone, pitch, and rhythm that a listener's body would respond involuntarily and immediately, before conscious thought had any real opportunity to evaluate or resist the instruction being given. A single carefully delivered word, spoken by a fully trained sister, could stop an armed guard in his tracks, compel a suspicious official to answer a question honestly against his own better judgment, or calm a panicked crowd with a speed no ordinary persuasion could ever hope to match. The underlying mechanism of the voice, however uncanny its practical effect, rested on genuine, documented human physiology rather than any mystical force. Human beings respond to certain vocal patterns, certain combinations of pitch, timing, and emphasis, with deeply ingrained, largely unconscious behavioral reflexes, patterns shaped across the whole of human evolutionary history by the way authority, urgency, and command have traditionally been communicated through spoken sound. Bene Gesserit training identified and systematically refined the specific vocal techniques capable of triggering these deep, largely involuntary responses with reliable, repeatable precision, transforming what exists in a rough, unrefined form in ordinary human speech into a genuinely powerful and genuinely dangerous trained capability. Learning to use the voice effectively required years of careful, dedicated practice, since the technique demanded a level of precise vocal control that took considerable time to develop even among naturally talented students. Early training exercises focused on identifying and eliminating the small, unconscious vocal habits that diluted a command's effectiveness, before progressing toward the considerably more difficult work of learning to deliver commands with exactly the right combination of tone and timing needed to trigger genuine, involuntary compliance rather than simply ordinary, resistible persuasion. The ethical and practical limits of the voice deserve careful examination within this history, since the technique's effectiveness varied considerably depending on the listener's own training, awareness, and mental state. Individuals with their own Bene Gesserit training or others specifically trained to resist vocal manipulation could recognize and resist a voice command with practice, meaning the technique worked most reliably against untrained, unprepared listeners rather than serving as any kind of universal, guaranteed override of another person's will. This limitation meant Bene Gesserit sisters needed to deploy the voice carefully and strategically, understanding that its effectiveness could never be assumed automatically in every circumstance. Paul Atreides himself trained partially in Bene Gesserit technique by his mother Jessica, despite this training violating strict sisterhood protocol, reserving such instruction for full members of the order. Developed his own considerable mastery of the voice, a capability that proved significant during his rise among the Fremen and his eventual confrontation with the wider Imperium. His unauthorized training in this and other Bene Gesserit techniques represented one of the clearest, most consequential examples of exactly how Jessica's own quiet defiance of sisterhood protocol would eventually reshape the course of the entire Imperium's history. The wider cultural impact of the voice across the Imperium cannot be overstated, since even people who had never personally encountered a trained sister using the technique had typically heard second-hand accounts detailed enough to generate genuine, lasting caution around Bene Gesserit sisters generally. A reputation for uncanny persuasive power that served the sisterhood's own broader political purposes by ensuring that even sisters who never actually used the voice in a given interaction still benefited from the caution and deference their reputation for possessing it reliably generated among people they dealt with across the whole of the Imperium. The specific vocal registers and vocal techniques underlying the voice required years of dedicated practice to master fully. Students working through carefully structured exercises designed to build precise, deliberate control over aspects of speech most people never consciously manage at all. The exact timing of a syllable's delivery, the precise modulation of pitch across a single short phrase, the careful control of breath supporting a command's full, intended effect. Instructors trained in this particular discipline worked individually with students across years of patient correction and patient refinement, since even small inconsistencies in delivery could mean the difference between a command that triggered genuine involuntary compliance and one that simply sounded, to an untrained ear, like an unusually forceful but ultimately resistible request. Bene Gesserit doctrine maintained careful internal guidelines regarding appropriate use of the voice, recognizing that indiscriminate reliance on the technique risked both ethical concern and practical exposure, since a population that grew accustomed to encountering voice commands would gradually develop its own collective wariness and its own collective resistance, eroding the technique's effectiveness through simple, gradual overuse in exactly the way any sufficiently well-known trick eventually loses its power once enough people learn to recognize and guard against it. Historical accounts of the voice being used against significant political figures across the Imperium, when they survive in any detail, illustrate the technique's genuine strategic value in crisis situations, allowing a single trained sister to diffuse or redirect confrontations that might otherwise have escalated into genuine violence, a peacekeeping function the sisterhood rarely received public credit for, since successful use of the voice, by its very nature, often left the affected party with only a vague, uncertain memory of having simply changed their own mind rather than any clear recollection of having been actively influenced by outside intervention. The training hierarchy governing who within the sisterhood was permitted to teach and to use the most advanced voice techniques reflected the order's own careful internal caution regarding a capability they understood better than anyone, carried genuine potential for serious misuse should it ever spread too widely or fall into hands lacking the ethical discipline the sisterhood's own extensive training worked so carefully to instill in every student before granting them access to techniques this powerful. In the end, the voice remained exactly what every other Bene Gesserit capability this history has examined tonight ultimately proved to be: not magic, but mastery, earned patiently, deployed carefully, and feared considerably more than its actual, explicable mechanism ever truly warranted among those who never bothered to look closely enough to understand it. Picture, for a moment, the sheer discipline required to speak a single sentence with exactly the right weight in exactly the right place, knowing that even a small mistake might mean the difference between a command that reshapes the room and words that simply, harmlessly, disappear into ordinary conversation. And you begin to understand why so few outside the sisterhood ever managed to reliably replicate what looked, from a distance, like such a simple, almost effortless trick. There is something worth carrying forward from this particular capability, beyond simple fascination with its mechanics, the reminder that words themselves, spoken carelessly, or spoken with genuine intention, carry more weight than we often credit them with in our own ordinary lives. A lesson the sisterhood simply took further and more seriously than almost anyone else ever thought to. Even now, long after the sisterhood's own particular reign of quiet influence has passed through so many further transformations, the basic principle underlying the voice remains worth remembering: that how something is said can matter every bit as much as what is actually being said. A small, patient truth hidden inside one of the Imperium's most feared and most misunderstood capabilities. Training a sister to use the voice reliably required years of careful, incremental practice under close supervision, since an improperly calibrated attempt risked either failing to produce any effect at all or, more dangerously, alerting a wary subject to the fact that some kind of manipulation was actively being attempted against them. Instructors emphasized restraint as heavily as technique itself, teaching students that the voice's real power lay not in constant use, but in patient reservation, deployed only when genuinely necessary and always with full awareness of the considerable ethical weight that came with overriding another person's own conscious will. A student who mastered the voice too early, before her own judgment had matured alongside her technical skill, was considered by her instructors a genuine liability rather than an early success, since raw capability, without the wisdom to wield it, carefully posed real danger to everyone around her, herself included. Up next, in Chapter 5, Reading the Truth in a Trembling Hand, we'll uncover how Bene Gesserit truthsayers learned to detect deception with an accuracy that made them essential advisors to rulers across the entire Imperium. Among the most politically valuable capabilities the Bene Gesserit sisterhood developed was the ability to detect deception with an accuracy no other institution within the Imperium could reliably match. A skill that made trained truthsayers essential advisors to rulers, nobles, and officials across the entire span of known space, valued specifically for their capacity to determine, with real confidence, whether the people they questioned were telling the truth. This capability, like every other Bene Gesserit skill this history has examined so far, rested entirely on trained, disciplined observation, rather than any mystical insight into another person's mind or another person's soul. Truth-saying relied on careful, extensively trained attention to the small, largely involuntary physical signals a human body produces when consciously constructing a lie rather than simply reporting genuine memory or genuine belief, subtle shifts in pulse, in breath, in muscle tension around the eyes and mouth that most people never learn to consciously notice, let alone reliably interpret. Bene Gesserit training taught students to observe these signals with a precision and a consistency that took years of dedicated practice to develop, building on the same foundational prana bindu discipline this history examined in an earlier chapter. Since detecting these subtle physical signals in another person required a level of trained perceptual sensitivity that itself depended on the practitioner's own mastery of conscious bodily awareness. The formal role of truthsayer within various noble courts across the Imperium carried genuine political significance, since a ruler with access to reliable deception detection possessed a considerable advantage in negotiation, in managing court intrigue, and in evaluating the loyalty of advisors and subordinates whose stated intentions might not always match their actual private agenda. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood cultivated this role carefully across the centuries, understanding that placing trained truthsayers within influential courts throughout the Imperium offered them both direct political influence and an invaluable, ongoing source of detailed information about the internal workings and internal conflicts of noble houses across the whole of known space. The specific training required to become a reliable truthsayer extended considerably beyond simple observation of physical signals, requiring students to develop sophisticated psychological understanding of how different individuals, shaped by different cultures, different personalities, and different levels of their own self-control, might express the physical signs of deception in subtly different ways. A skilled truthsayer needed to account for this individual variation rather than applying any single rigid template of what deception supposedly looked like. A nuanced skill that distinguished genuinely expert Bene Gesserit truthsayers from less thoroughly trained practitioners whose judgments proved considerably less reliable across the full range of people and circumstances they might eventually encounter. Gaius Helen Mohiam, the Reverend Mother, whose role in testing young Paul Atreides this history will examine in considerably more detail in a later chapter. served as one of the sisterhood's most respected truthsayers, a position that placed her in direct, ongoing contact with the imperial court and gave her considerable insight into the political currents shaping the wider Imperium during the crucial years surrounding House Atreides' fateful move to Arrakis. The particular limits of even expert truth-saying deserve acknowledgement within this history, since the technique detected the physical signs of conscious deception rather than any absolute, infallible access to objective truth. A person who genuinely believed a false statement, having been deceived themselves or having convinced themselves of something inaccurate, would not necessarily display the physical signals of deception a trained truthsayer relied upon, meaning the technique offered powerful but not absolute insight into the actual truth of any given situation, a limitation the sisterhood's own training took care to instill clearly in every student who developed this particular valuable skill. Beyond formal court positions, truth-saying capability made individual Bene Gesserit sisters valuable in a considerably wider range of situations throughout the Imperium. From evaluating potential marriage partners for noble families concerned about hidden deception, to assisting in criminal investigations, where determining genuine truth from convenient fabrication carried real consequence for the people involved. This broad practical utility meant truth-saying skill remained one of the sisterhood's most consistently valuable and most consistently requested services across the whole of their long institutional history, generating both genuine goodwill and genuine ongoing income that helped sustain the sisterhood's own considerable operating expenses across so many centuries of continued institutional activity. The specific challenge of maintaining truth-saying objectivity while also serving the sisterhood's own broader political interests created its own quiet, ongoing tension for sisters serving in this particular role. Since a truthsayer whose reports consistently happened to favor Bene Gesserit interests risked, over time, undermining the very reputation for reliable objectivity that made her services valuable in the first place, a tension the sisterhood's own careful training worked to address through instilling genuine professional discipline distinct from any individual sister's own broader institutional loyalty. The considerable demand for reliable truth-saying services across the Imperium meant qualified sisters could command genuine influence and genuine compensation for their work, income that helped fund the wider sisterhood's own considerable operating costs, while simultaneously placing trained observers with genuine institutional loyalty inside countless negotiations, trials, and political discussions across the whole of known space, a dual benefit of financial sustainability and information gathering that made truth-saying one of the sisterhood's most consistently valuable institutional functions across their entire long history. Some truth-sayers developed particular specialization within specific domains, certain sisters becoming especially valued for evaluating commercial negotiations, others for political intrigue, still others for the more delicate work of family and marriage disputes among noble houses, a natural division of expertise that emerged organically as individual sisters gained experience and reputation within particular kinds of deception evaluation across their own individual careers. Nothing about this capability required anything beyond patient, careful observation refined across years of dedicated practice, a lesson worth carrying forward as this history continues tracing every other piece of sisterhood capability the wider Imperium so persistently and so inaccurately chose to call magic instead. There is something quietly reassuring, examined honestly, in learning that even the sisterhood's most feared capability rested on nothing more exotic than exceptionally close attention paid to things everyone else simply overlooked. A reminder that genuine expertise, however impressive its results, so often comes down to nothing more mysterious than looking more carefully, for longer, than anyone else around you was ever willing to. Reliable truthsayers remained, across the whole of the sisterhood's long history, considerably rarer than their reputation might suggest. The genuine mastery required taking years even the most naturally observant students needed to fully develop, meaning demand for their particular services consistently exceeded the sisterhood's own considerable capacity to supply them across the whole of the Imperium's countless courts and countless negotiations. Scarcity, in this particular case, only deepened the sisterhood's own considerable reputation and considerable leverage. A trained truthsayer's rare, hard-won presence at any negotiation carrying weight, precisely because everyone involved understood exactly how difficult that particular expertise genuinely was to acquire. Truth-saying itself demanded a peculiar kind of sustained attention that few outside the sisterhood ever fully appreciated, since a skilled truthsayer could not simply relax her focus between questions, but needed to maintain continuous, careful observation throughout an entire negotiation or interrogation, tracking subtle physiological shifts across hours of conversation that might otherwise pass entirely unnoticed by anyone without her specific training. This sustained vigilance took a genuine physical and mental toll, explaining why even the most experienced truthsayers limited how many formal sessions they accepted within any given period, protecting their own considerable expertise from the kind of fatigue that might otherwise compromise its reliability. Even the most gifted natural observers among sisterhood candidates still required years of supervised practice before their instructors trusted their judgment enough to certify them for genuinely consequential truth-saying work out in the wider Imperium. Up next in Chapter 6, The Litany Against Fear, we'll uncover the specific mental discipline the Bene Gesserit developed to master their own fear under even the most extreme and most dangerous circumstances. Perhaps no single piece of Bene Gesserit teaching has traveled further beyond the sisterhood's own walls than the Litany Against Fear, a carefully structured mental discipline every trained sister learned and could recite from memory, designed to help a practitioner face genuinely dangerous or genuinely overwhelming circumstances, without allowing fear itself to compromise clear thinking or effective action. The litany's specific wording, naming fear as the mind killer and describing a careful, deliberate process of allowing fear to pass through and over the practitioner rather than fighting it directly, reflects a sophisticated psychological understanding of exactly how panic actually degrades human cognitive and physical performance under genuine pressure. This particular teaching illustrates something important about the sisterhood's broader approach to mental discipline that this history has already begun tracing across earlier chapters. Rather than attempting to eliminate fear entirely, an approach most psychological traditions across human history have found genuinely impossible to sustain reliably. Bene Gesserit training instead taught practitioners to acknowledge fear honestly while preventing it from disrupting the careful, precise thinking and precise physical control every other sisterhood skill actually depended upon. Fear, in this framework, was treated not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a natural, passing phenomenon to be consciously managed and allowed to pass through the practitioner without leaving lasting disruption behind it. The practical applications of this discipline extended across nearly every dangerous or high-pressure circumstance a Bene Gesserit sister might encounter across her working life, from physical combat to the genuinely life-threatening ordeal of consuming the water of life during her transformation into a full, reverend mother. A trial this history will examine in considerably more detail in a later chapter. Sisters who mastered the litany's underlying discipline consistently displayed a capacity to maintain clear, effective judgment under circumstances that would overwhelm an untrained person's ability to think or act effectively at all. a capability that contributed significantly to the sisterhood's broader reputation for uncanny composure and uncanny effectiveness, even in the most dangerous or most chaotic situations. Young Paul Atreides famously recited a version of this same litany during his own Gom Jabbar testing. The ordeal this history's later chapters will examine directly, using the mental discipline his mother had taught him, in violation of strict sisterhood protocol, to endure genuinely excruciating pain without withdrawing his hand from the box that would have otherwise triggered his own immediate death. This early, dramatic demonstration of the litany's practical power offers this history one of its clearest illustrations of exactly how effective the underlying discipline could prove even for someone considerably younger and considerably less thoroughly trained than a full Bene Gesserit sister. Teaching the litany to young students required considerable patience on the part of Bene Gesserit instructors, since genuinely internalizing the discipline demanded far more than simple memorization of its words, requiring instead years of practiced application under progressively more challenging circumstances before a student could reliably call upon the technique's full protective effect. During genuinely extreme, genuinely unpredictable moments of real danger or real crisis, the wider psychological principles underlying the litany, treating difficult emotional states as temporary phenomena to be consciously observed and allowed to pass rather than suppressed or fought directly, reflect a sophistication in Bene Gesserit's psychological training that considerably exceeded most other traditions of mental discipline documented across the wider Imperium's long history. A sophistication this account will continue to trace as we move forward into the sisterhood's broader political and genetic ambitions across the chapters still ahead tonight. The litany's full text, preserved and taught identically across countless generations of Bene Gesserit students, achieved a kind of cultural significance extending well beyond the sisterhood's own membership, with fragments of its language occasionally surfacing in wider imperial culture among people who had encountered the teaching secondhand through contact with trained sisters or through the wider mythology that had grown up around Bene Gesserit capability across the centuries. This wider cultural penetration offers its own quiet evidence of just how genuinely effective and just how genuinely valuable ordinary people across the Imperium recognized this particular piece of psychological discipline to be, regardless of its actual Bene Gesserit origin. Teaching the litany to non-sisterhood members remained officially discouraged throughout most of Bene Gesserit history, the order preferring to maintain their own considerable investment in psychological discipline as one among many advantages distinguishing trained sisters from the wider untrained population, though individual exceptions, including Jessica's own teaching of the technique to young Paul, demonstrate that this restriction was never absolute, bending occasionally under the weight of genuine personal relationship and genuine personal judgment regarding what a particular situation actually required. Comparative study of the litany against similar psychological disciplines documented elsewhere across human history reveals genuine originality in the Bene Gesserit approach, combining elements recognizable from older meditative and philosophical traditions with a distinctly practical, outcome-focused orientation suited to the specific dangers sisters actually faced across their working lives, rather than treating fear management as an abstract spiritual pursuit disconnected from immediate, concrete survival need. The particular cadence and particular rhythm of the litany's recitation, taught with careful attention to exact phrasing and exact pacing, reflected the same underlying understanding of vocal and physiological technique that shaped the sisterhood's development of the voice itself, suggesting that Bene Gesserit teaching consistently recognized deep, practical connections between spoken language, physiological state, and psychological discipline across nearly every dimension of their extensive training curriculum. A quiet piece of wisdom carried forward across centuries, offered freely enough that even a frightened young boy on the edge of death could reach for it, and find, in that reaching, exactly the steadiness he needed most. There is a certain generosity in a teaching this useful being shared so widely, even if only in fragments, and even if the sisterhood itself never fully intended it to travel quite so far beyond their own carefully guarded walls. A reminder that even the most closely held institutional knowledge has a way of eventually finding the people who genuinely need it most. Fear, faced honestly and repeatedly across an entire disciplined lifetime, gradually loses some of its sharpest edges, not because it disappears entirely, but because the person carrying it has simply had enough patient practice recognizing exactly what it is, and exactly how, eventually, it always does pass. Let that particular lesson settle gently over you now too. However far removed your own night happens to be from any Gom Jabbar or any genuine desert danger, since fear, wherever it finds us, tends to respond to exactly this same patient, quiet acknowledgement. Instructors teaching the litany paid particular attention to a student's very first genuine encounter with real fear, rather than merely simulated classroom pressure, since this initial real-world test tended to reveal, far more reliably than any amount of prior drilling, whether the underlying discipline had actually taken root or remained only a memorized set of words a frightened student might forget entirely the moment genuine danger actually arrived. Up next in Chapter 7, the Missionaria Protectiva, will uncover how the sisterhood deliberately planted protective religious belief across countless worlds throughout the Imperium. Among the Bene Gesserit sisterhood's most consequential and most carefully guarded institutional projects was the Missionaria Protectiva, a systematic program of deliberately seeding specific religious beliefs, superstitions, and prophecies among primitive or isolated populations across countless worlds throughout the Imperium, not from any genuine religious conviction on the sisterhood's own part, but as a calculated, practical survival tool designed to protect individual sisters who might someday find themselves stranded or endangered in remote corners of known space, far from any immediate Bene Gesserit support. The underlying logic of this program rested on careful, patient calculation extending across generations. If a population on some remote world already believed, through careful and gradual religious seeding conducted decades or even centuries earlier, that a powerful outworld figure might someday arrive among them fulfilling ancient prophecy, then any Bene Gesserit sister who later found herself genuinely stranded on that same world could potentially draw on this pre-planted belief to secure protection, respect, or practical assistance from a population otherwise entirely unfamiliar with her or with the wider Imperium she came from. Implementing this program required extraordinary patience and extraordinary long-term planning, since the religious beliefs being seeded needed decades or generations to take genuine root within a population's own cultural and spiritual tradition before they could reliably serve their intended protective purpose. Bene Gesserit agents assigned to this work traveled to remote worlds specifically to introduce carefully crafted prophecy and carefully crafted religious language into existing local belief systems, working with enough subtlety that the seeded beliefs would gradually integrate into a culture's own developing tradition, rather than appearing as any obviously foreign or obviously recent addition that later generations might recognize as artificial or externally imposed. Arrakis itself offers this history's clearest and most historically consequential example of the Missionaria Protectiva's actual practical operation, since generations of careful Bene Gesserit seeding among the native Fremen population had planted detailed, specific prophecy regarding an eventual outworld messiah, a Lisan al-Gaib, who would arrive among them possessing prescient power and would lead them toward eventual paradise. This carefully planted belief, seeded generations before Paul Atreides was ever born, existed purely as a practical protective measure intended to offer safety to any stranded sister who might eventually need to draw upon it. Never intended by its original architects to actually shape the rise of a genuine, historically consequential messianic figure commanding real military and religious power. What happened instead? Once Paul and his mother Jessica arrived among the Fremen as genuine refugees, rather than as any planned test of the seeded prophecy, represents one of history's more striking examples of a carefully engineered contingency plan escaping entirely beyond its original architect's intention and control. Paul's own genuine prescient ability, combined with Jessica's genuine Bene Gesserit training, allowed the two of them to draw on the seeded Fremen prophecy far more completely and far more consequentially than the Missionaria Protectiva's original planners had ever anticipated any single stranded sister and her son might actually manage to achieve. Fremen elders, who eventually learned the full truth behind their own oldest prophecy in the years following Paul's rise, reacted with genuinely varied response, some feeling betrayed by a faith they now understood as deliberately manufactured, others finding that the discovery changed remarkably little about how genuinely and how deeply that faith had shaped their own lives and their own culture. Across so many prior generations, regardless of its true, distant origin, the wider Bene Gesserit leadership's reaction to watching their own carefully planted contingency plan grow into the foundation of Paul's eventual jihad reveals considerable insight into the genuine risk embedded within the Missionaria Protectiva's entire underlying strategy. A tool designed purely for individual sister protection had proven capable, under the right unusual circumstances, of reshaping the trajectory of the entire Imperium, a lesson in unintended consequence the sisterhood would continue reckoning with across the whole of the tumultuous history still to come in this account. The Fremen version of this seeded prophecy carried particular sophistication in its construction, weaving together specific, checkable signs, an outworld origin, prescient capability, a mother trained in the old ways that a genuine Bene Gesserit sister could deliberately invoke and deliberately fulfill under the right circumstances, while remaining vague enough in its larger promises that the prophecy could not easily be disproven by any single failed expectation. This careful balance between specificity and flexibility represented considerable sophistication in religious engineering, refined across generations of Missionaria Protectiva practice applied to countless different populations across the whole of the Imperium. Later Bene Gesserit assessment of the Arrakis seeding specifically noted, with the benefit of hindsight, the sisterhood's own centuries of accumulated other memory eventually provided, that the Fremen population's own particular cultural desperation, shaped by generations of harsh desert survival and generations of Harkonnen oppression, had made them unusually receptive to the seeded prophecy's promise of eventual outworld salvation. A receptiveness the original architects of the Fremen seeding effort had anticipated in general terms, but had never imagined would eventually combine with a genuine, historically consequential Kwisatz Haderach to produce consequences on the scale Paul's actual rise ultimately achieved. The particular terminology the Fremen used when speaking of the promised Lisan al-Gaib, and the specific ritual expectations surrounding his eventual arrival, followed patterns Bene Gesserit seeding agents had refined across countless other worlds, borrowing structural elements from older human religious tradition that consistently proved effective at generating genuine, lasting devotion regardless of which particular population eventually received the carefully tailored local version of the broader Missionaria Protectiva template. Some later Bene Gesserit critics of the program writing after its consequences on Arrakis had become fully apparent, argued that the very effectiveness of the seeding technique represented its own kind of warning the sisterhood should have heeded more carefully, since a tool capable of generating genuine, sincere religious devotion, powerful enough to sustain a population through generations of hardship, was, by its very nature, powerful enough to eventually produce consequences considerably beyond whatever narrow protective purpose its original architects had ever intended. A tool meant only to offer quiet shelter to a single stranded traveler had grown, without anyone fully choosing it, into the scaffolding for an empire. Sit with that irony for a moment before we move forward. The careful architects of protective fiction eventually finding themselves genuinely, deeply moved by watching their own fabricated prophecy fulfilled by real people, in real danger, achieving something the fiction's original authors had never actually believed possible when they first quietly planted it, generations earlier, among a population they expected simply to keep the belief alive without ever truly needing it. Later generations of Bene Gesserit historians, reviewing the Missionaria Protectiva's accumulated results across dozens of separate seeded worlds, noted a recurring pattern worth recording here, that populations receiving this careful seeding rarely showed any measurable difference in general well-being compared to worlds that received none, except during the specific, rare crises the seeding had actually been designed to address, at which point the difference proved enormous, often meaning the survival rather than the extinction of a stranded sister's entire mission. This narrow but decisive value, invisible in ordinary times and indispensable in extraordinary ones, captured something essential about how the wider sisterhood approached nearly every long-term investment it ever made. Agents who spent years embedded within a single-seeded population sometimes described a quiet, private difficulty rarely discussed openly within the wider sisterhood. The particular strangeness of living for extended periods among people who sincerely believed a story the agent herself knew, with complete certainty, to be a carefully constructed fiction. A tension that required its own considerable discipline to manage, without ever betraying the deception through even a single unguarded moment. Up next, in Chapter 8, Seeding Prophecy Across 1,000 Worlds, we'll uncover the broader scale and broader methodology of this remarkable, centuries-long project across the whole of the known Imperium. The scale of the Missionaria Protectiva's operation across the wider Imperium considerably exceeded what most people, even well-informed nobles and scholars, generally understood about the sisterhood's actual reach and actual influence. Bene Gesserit agents had, across many centuries of patient, careful work, planted some version of protective religious seeding on a substantial number of worlds throughout known space, particularly on more isolated or more technologically limited planets where a stranded sister might otherwise find herself with no other reliable source of protection or assistance. The specific content of these seeded beliefs varied considerably from world to world, carefully tailored to fit each particular population's own existing cultural and religious framework, rather than following any single, rigid template applied uniformly everywhere. Bene Gesserit agents conducting this work studied local culture extensively before introducing any new religious element, ensuring that whatever prophecy or belief they planted would integrate naturally into a population's own developing spiritual tradition, rather than standing out as an obviously foreign addition that later generations might eventually question or reject. This careful attention to cultural integration required Bene Gesserit agents to possess considerable anthropological and linguistic sophistication alongside their more standard sisterhood training, since successfully seeding a belief that would genuinely take root and genuinely persist across multiple generations demanded a nuanced understanding of exactly how religious and cultural tradition actually develops and actually spreads within a given population, knowledge the sisterhood cultivated carefully as part of the broader intellectual education every Bene Gesserit sister received during her own extensive early training. The moral dimension of this entire program deserves honest consideration within this history, since the Missionaria Protectiva involved deliberately manipulating the genuine religious beliefs of entire populations, planting false prophecy for purely instrumental reasons connected to sisterhood self-interest rather than any genuine spiritual conviction. Whatever practical protective benefit this program eventually offered individual stranded sisters, it came at a real cost to the populations whose religious tradition was quietly and permanently altered without their own knowledge or their own genuine consent. A cost the sisterhood's own internal philosophy generally treated as an acceptable price for the practical protection the program reliably provided across the centuries it remained active. Record-keeping regarding exactly which worlds had received Missionaria Protectiva seeding and exactly what specific beliefs had been planted where represented one of the sisterhood's most closely guarded categories of internal information, maintained carefully across generations specifically so that any sister traveling to a new or unfamiliar world could quickly consult whether useful. Protective belief already existed there, and if so, exactly how to properly invoke it without inadvertently exposing the belief's true artificial origin to a population that had, by that point, likely come to hold it as genuine, sincere faith. The considerable resources and considerable patience this program required across so many centuries illustrates something essential about the Bene Gesserit sisterhood's broader institutional character that this history has already begun establishing across earlier chapters. A willingness to invest enormous, sustained effort into projects whose practical benefit might not materialize for generations, trusting that the careful, patient work would eventually prove valuable, even though no single sister involved in any particular seeding effort could ever be certain her own specific work would personally benefit her or anyone she would ever actually meet. The specific agents the sisterhood dispatched to conduct this delicate seeding work underwent their own specialized training beyond the standard Bene Gesserit education this history examined in earlier chapters, developing particular expertise in comparative religion, linguistics, and cultural anthropology that equipped them to work effectively across an enormous diversity of human cultures. Scattered throughout the Imperium, each with its own distinct language, its own distinct social structure, and its own distinct existing religious tradition that any successful seeding effort needed to respectfully and effectively integrate with, rather than simply override. Records of this program's full extent, maintained carefully within the sisterhood's own most protected archives, suggest an operation considerably larger in scope than most outside observers, even sophisticated ones, ever fully appreciated. A quiet, patient infrastructure of protective belief spread across the Imperium that most populations who actually held these seeded beliefs never once suspected had originated from any deliberate outside intervention rather than their own community's genuine, independent spiritual development. Coordination between the Missionaria Protectiva program and the wider Bene Gesserit intelligence network meant that seeding efforts on any given world could be adjusted or refined over time as agents gathered ongoing information about how a particular population's religious tradition was actually developing, allowing the sisterhood to make careful, incremental corrections to seeded belief across generations rather than treating any single initial seeding effort as a fixed, unchangeable intervention immune to further institutional refinement. The considerable financial and logistical resources required to sustain this program across so many worlds and across so many centuries speak to the genuine institutional priority the sisterhood placed on this particular long-term project. Resources drawn from the sisterhood's own considerable wealth accumulated through truth-saying services, genetic consultation, and the countless other practical contributions trained sisters offered noble households throughout the Imperium in exchange for compensation that ultimately helped fund the Order's own much larger, much less visible institutional ambitions. 1,000 worlds, each quietly carrying a small piece of the sisterhood's own careful design, waiting patiently for a need that might never come, or might, someday, change absolutely everything. Somewhere out among those 1,000 quiet worlds, populations still carry stories they believe entirely their own, never once suspecting the careful, patient hand that once helped shape them. And there is something worth sitting with in that thought too. A reminder of how thoroughly even our deepest convictions can be gently, invisibly influenced by forces we never think to question. Consider, too, how many other quiet acts of institutional patience across human history might share this same essential shape. Small interventions made by people who will never personally see their fullest consequence, trusting instead that careful, honest work, however invisible in the moment, tends eventually to matter. That trust, extended patiently across centuries by generation after generation of sisters who would never personally witness the program's fullest results, represents its own quiet, remarkable act of institutional faith. However secular and however calculated its underlying reasoning actually remained. Later scholars, attempting to reconstruct the Missionaria Protectiva's full historical footprint, faced a peculiar methodological problem worth noting here. That the program's very success at cultural integration meant its clearest traces were often the hardest to distinguish from genuinely independent religious development, leaving even the sisterhood's own most careful internal historians occasionally uncertain, centuries later, which particular local beliefs had originated from deliberate seeding and which had simply arisen on their own from a given population's own authentic spiritual imagination. Up next in Chapter 9, The Breeding Index, we'll uncover the sisterhood's other great long-term project, a careful, patient program of genetic planning stretching across countless noble bloodlines and countless generations. Running alongside the Missionaria Protectiva's careful religious seeding and considerably exceeding it in scale, patience, and ultimate historical consequence was the Bene Gesserit Breeding Index, a comprehensive, centuries-long genetic program tracking and carefully arranging marriages and pairings among noble bloodlines across the whole of the Imperium, all working patiently toward a single, specific genetic outcome the sisterhood's own leadership understood clearly, but revealed to almost no one outside their innermost circle. The breeding index itself existed as an extraordinarily detailed genealogical record, maintained and updated across generations, tracking not merely family lineage in the ordinary sense, but specific genetic traits, particularly traits connected to prescient sensitivity and psychological resilience, that the sisterhood had identified as relevant to their long-term genetic project. Bene Gesserit agents worked carefully and often invisibly within noble households across the Imperium, arranging marriages, encouraging particular pairings, and occasionally intervening more directly when a particular genetic combination seemed sufficiently important to the program's larger goals to warrant more active sisterhood involvement. The specific genetic outcome this entire program worked toward, stretching back across generations before any single participating family could have possibly understood the program's true final purpose, centered on producing a figure the sisterhood called the Kwisatz Haderach, a male practitioner capable of accessing both the male and female lines of ancestral memory simultaneously. A capability this history will examine in considerably more detail in an upcoming chapter, one that the sisterhood's own female members, bound entirely to their own maternal ancestral line, could never achieve on their own, regardless of how thoroughly trained or how genetically favored any individual sister happened to be. Individual families and individual women involved in this breeding program typically possessed only the smallest, most immediate understanding of their own particular role within it. Encouraged towards specific marriages or specific pairings through careful Bene Gesserit guidance, without ever learning the full, centuries-spanning purpose their own children's births were actually serving. This deliberate compartmentalization of knowledge protected the program's overall integrity, ensuring that no single family's own ambition or own resistance could meaningfully disrupt a plan whose true scale and true purpose remained visible only to the sisterhood's own highest leadership. The genetic sophistication underlying this entire program considerably exceeded what most other institutions across the Imperium, however scientifically advanced in other respects, had ever achieved in the specific domain of applied human genetics. The sisterhood, drawing on centuries of accumulated data and accumulated observation to make genetic predictions and genetic recommendations, with a level of practical accuracy that, to outside observers unfamiliar with the program's actual scientific basis, appeared to border on genuine prophecy rather than simply unusually rigorous applied science. Lady Jessica's own position within this vast, patient program placed her at what the sisterhood's own calculations identified as an especially crucial juncture. Instructed explicitly to bear a daughter for Duke Leto Atreides, whose eventual marriage to a specific Harkonnen heir would complete the program's genetic goal exactly one generation later than what would actually occur once Jessica made her own, considerably more personal choice regarding her son's birth. A choice this history will examine directly in the chapter immediately following this one. The technical genetic knowledge underlying the breeding index far exceeded what most other institutions throughout the Imperium had developed in comparable fields, the sisterhood maintaining detailed records not merely of who married whom, but of specific traits, temperament, physical resilience, prescient sensitivity when observable, tracked meticulously across generations and cross-referenced against outcomes in ways that allowed increasingly refined predictions about which particular pairings were most likely to advance the program's careful, long-term genetic goals. House Carino and House Harkonnen, alongside House Atreides, all featured prominently within the sisterhood's careful genetic calculations at various points across the centuries preceding Paul's birth. Each bloodline valued for particular genetic contributions the sisterhood's own accumulated data suggested might prove useful to the larger project. A reminder that the breeding index treated even the Imperium's most bitter political rivals as simply different resources within the same patient, calculating framework, indifferent to the political enmities that shaped so much of ordinary imperial life and ordinary imperial conflict. The generational patience this entire project demanded becomes especially clear when considering that most individual sisters working on any given portion of the breeding index across their own careers would never personally witness the program's ultimate completion, contributing instead to a project whose true final outcome lay generations beyond their own working lifetime. Trusting the wider institutional continuity of the sisterhood itself to eventually carry the work through to whatever conclusion their own careful calculations had originally projected. Access to the full breeding index remained restricted even within the sisterhood's own membership, with only senior reverend mothers holding sufficiently high institutional standing granted complete access to the program's actual scope and actual genetic reasoning. A compartmentalization of knowledge that protected the program's integrity, while also concentrating enormous institutional power within a relatively small circle of the sisterhood's most senior and most trusted leadership. Every marriage arranged, every pairing quietly encouraged, another single, patient stitch in a tapestry no one participant could ever see completed in their own lifetime. There is something worth pausing on here, a genuinely uncomfortable truth this history has tried not to soften. The same patient, disciplined institution, capable of producing truth-sayers and healers and skilled political advisors, was, at the very same time, treating the reproductive choices of countless individual women across the Imperium as simply another variable to be calculated and arranged. A tension between genuine care and genuine instrumentalization that ran through the whole of the sisterhood's long, complicated relationship with the very women who made up its own considerable membership. A quiet, uncomfortable thread worth carrying honestly forward as this history continues. It is easy, from a comfortable distance and with the benefit of many centuries of hindsight, to judge the sisterhood harshly for this particular dimension of their long institutional practice, and considerably harder to imagine what genuine alternative might have actually achieved comparable results across a civilization this vast and this politically fragmented. A tension this history leaves honestly unresolved rather than offering any easy, comfortable verdict. Some questions, examined honestly enough, simply resist tidy resolution, and this history has tried, throughout tonight's telling, to sit patiently with that discomfort, rather than smoothing it away for the sake of a simpler, more comfortable story. Individual sisters recruited specifically to manage particular threads of the breeding index across their own careers often describe the work, in whatever private reflections survive, as a strange mixture of genuine intellectual satisfaction and genuine moral discomfort, tracking generations of human lives reduced to careful genetic notation while knowing that each entry represented an actual person living an actual life, largely unaware of the quiet institutional attention their own family's particular bloodline had attracted. Up next, in Chapter 10, the Reverend Mother's Ordeal will uncover the dangerous, transformative trial every sister needed to survive before rising to the sisterhood's highest recognized rank. Rising to the rank of Reverend Mother within the Bene Gesserit sisterhood required surviving one of the most genuinely dangerous ordeals documented anywhere within the wider Imperium, a trial that had killed every single woman who had ever previously attempted it without the specific genetic and psychological preparation the sisterhood's own extensive training provided. This ordeal involved consuming the water of life, a substance distilled from the liquid exhalation of a drowning sandworm, poisonous enough in its original form to kill an ordinary person almost instantly upon consumption. The specific challenge facing any sister attempting this transformation involved not simply surviving the poison's initial toxic effect, but actively transmuting the substance within her own body, using the full extent of her prana bindu training to alter the poison's molecular structure through conscious physiological control, converting a lethal toxin into something her body could safely process and, remarkably, benefit from directly. This transmutation demanded a level of bodily control considerably beyond even the already extraordinary capabilities most fully trained sisters possessed, explaining why the ordeal claimed the lives of any sister whose training or whose natural capability proved insufficient to the task. Successfully completing this transformation granted the surviving sister access to something the Bene Gesserit called other memory, a genuine, direct connection to the accumulated consciousness and accumulated experience of every previous Reverend Mother who had undergone the same transformation before her, reaching back across countless generations of sisterhood history. This inherited awareness, a topic this history will examine in considerably greater depth in the chapter immediately following this one, granted new Reverend Mothers access to wisdom, memory, and perspective no single human lifetime could otherwise have possibly accumulated, transforming the successful sister into something considerably more than the individual woman who had begun the dangerous ordeal. The ceremony itself, conducted within the presence of the sietch or sisterhood community where a particular sister underwent her transformation, carried enormous ritual and religious significance, especially within Fremen culture, where the role of Reverend Mother served both spiritual and practical leadership functions within each individual desert community. Witnesses to a successful transformation described profound physical and psychological changes visible in the transforming sister even during the ordeal itself, her body and her expression shifting in ways that reflected the genuine, total transformation occurring within her. Lady Jessica's own transformation into a Reverend Mother, undertaken among the Fremen at Sietch Tabor during the period of exile this history has examined in earlier chapters, carried particular significance and particular risk beyond what an ordinary sisterhood transformation would have involved, since Jessica was pregnant at the time with her daughter Alia, meaning the transformation's effects reached the unborn child as well, granting Alia the same accumulated ancestral awareness her mother received, though delivered to a mind not yet born rather than to a fully formed adult consciousness, a distinction that produced the unusual and eventually quite dangerous preborn condition this history's companion account of Paul's own family has already examined in considerable detail. The sisterhood's own careful, ongoing study of exactly why some sisters survived this transformation, while others died attempting it, never fully resolved into any complete, reliable predictive formula, meaning every individual Reverend Mother candidacy carried genuine, irreducible risk, regardless of how thoroughly the candidate had otherwise prepared. A sobering reminder that even the Bene Gesserit sisterhood's extraordinary discipline and extraordinary training could not entirely eliminate danger from the most consequential and most transformative trial their entire order required its most senior members to eventually undertake. Fremen Reverend Mothers, distinct from but connected to the wider Bene Gesserit sisterhood structure, held particular local significance within their own individual sietch communities, serving simultaneously as spiritual leaders and as practical repositories of the specific desert survival knowledge and specific tribal history relevant to their own particular community, a role considerably more locally embedded than the wider political and genetic functions Reverend Mothers serving directly within core sisterhood institutions typically fulfilled across their own careers. The physical toll the Water of Life ordeal exacted even on successful candidates deserves acknowledgement within this history, since surviving sisters frequently described the transformation as leaving lasting physical changes beyond the acquisition of other memory itself. Alterations in eye color and skin tone connected to prolonged spice exposure that made successfully transformed Reverend Mothers visually distinct from untransformed sisters, a visible, permanent marker of the profound biological transformation the ordeal represented. There is something worth admiring, honestly, in an institution willing to demand this much of its own most senior and most trusted members, rather than reserving genuine risk and genuine sacrifice only for those with the least power to refuse it, a consistency of standard that ran, however imperfectly, through much of what made the sisterhood genuinely different from simple, ordinary institutional hierarchy elsewhere across the Imperium. Preparation for the ordeal itself involved considerable prior training beyond the standard Bene Gesserit education every sister received, candidates working specifically on strengthening the particular prana bindu skills most directly relevant to the transmutation process, under the close guidance of established Reverend Mothers who could offer practical insight drawn from their own successful transformation that no purely theoretical instruction could adequately substitute for. The ceremonial trappings surrounding a Reverend Mother transformation varied somewhat between core sisterhood institutions and Fremen Sietch communities, reflecting each context's own particular cultural and religious tradition, though the fundamental biological and psychological reality of the ordeal itself. The genuine risk of death, the genuine transmutation of a lethal poison, the genuine flood of inherited ancestral memory that followed successful completion remained essentially consistent, regardless of which particular community witnessed and celebrated any individual sister's transformation. A single swallow, a single terrible risk, and either a new Reverend Mother rose from it, or nothing at all remained to rise. Think, for a moment, of every single woman who ever attempted this ordeal and did not survive it, names largely lost now to the sisterhood's own careful, guarded record-keeping. Each one a genuine loss. Each one a reminder that even an institution built almost entirely around patient calculation could never fully eliminate the real human cost woven into its most consequential and most transformative traditions. Let their memory rest gently here for a moment, unnamed but not forgotten, before we turn toward what their successful sisters actually carried forward from the ordeal they did not survive. Sisters preparing for their own eventual Reverend Mother candidacy often spent years working closely alongside women who had already survived the transformation, absorbing not formal instruction so much as a kind of quiet, accumulated confidence transmitted simply through sustained proximity to someone who had already faced the ordeal and lived. A psychological preparation the sisterhood's own leadership considered every bit as essential as the more technical Prana Bindu training candidates received in the years leading up to their own attempt. Up next in Chapter 11, Other Memory, Carrying Every Woman Who Came Before, will uncover exactly what this inherited ancestral awareness actually felt like, and how Reverend Mothers learned to manage its considerable psychological weight. Other memory represented one of the most profound and most psychologically demanding capabilities any Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother acquired through her successful transformation, granting direct, experiential access to the accumulated consciousness of every previous Reverend Mother stretching back across countless generations of sisterhood history. This was not simple historical knowledge learned secondhand through study, but genuine, first-person memory, as though the newly transformed sister had personally lived through every experience her ancestral predecessors had once lived through themselves. The sheer scale of this inherited awareness posed genuine psychological challenges even for sisters whose extensive prior training had prepared them as thoroughly as possible for the transformation. A newly minted Reverend Mother needed to learn, often across a considerable subsequent period of careful practice, how to navigate this vast internal chorus of ancestral voices and ancestral perspective without becoming overwhelmed or disoriented by input from so many different lived experiences competing simultaneously for her conscious attention. Established Reverend Mothers within any given sisterhood community typically provided considerable guidance and considerable support to newly transformed sisters during this difficult adjustment period, drawing on their own earlier experience of the same challenging transition. The practical value other memory offered the sisterhood proved considerable, granting individual Reverend Mothers access to genuine historical knowledge, accumulated wisdom, and pattern recognition spanning centuries that no single human lifetime, however long or however well educated, could ever hope to independently accumulate. This inherited perspective informed Bene Gesserit political and genetic planning at every level, allowing senior sisters to draw on genuinely comprehensive historical precedent when evaluating current circumstances or planning future strategy. A capability that contributed significantly to the sisterhood's broader reputation for uncanny foresight and uncanny political sophistication across the whole of their long institutional history. The particular danger embedded within other memory, a danger this history's companion account of the Atreides family has already examined in connection with Aaliyah's own tragic experience, involved the risk that a sufficiently strong ancestral personality present within this accumulated inheritance might, under certain circumstances, particularly when a Reverend Mother's transformation occurred before birth rather than in a fully developed adult mind, grow strong enough to seize dominant, permanent control over the transformed individual's own consciousness, a condition the sisterhood termed abomination and worked carefully, through generations of accumulated caution and accumulated protocol, to prevent whenever genuinely possible. Individual Reverend Mothers developed their own particular relationship with their inherited other memory across the years following their transformation, some drawing heavily and frequently on specific ancestral perspectives relevant to their own particular areas of responsibility within the wider sisterhood, others maintaining a more careful, measured distance from the full accumulated inheritance, understanding intuitively that constant, unrestrained engagement with so many competing ancestral voices carried its own genuine psychological risk, even for sisters who had never displayed any sign of the more severe abomination condition. This accumulated inheritance passed forward and continuously expanded with each new Reverend Mother's own successful transformation, meant that the Bene Gesserit sisterhood as a whole possessed, in a very real and continuously growing sense, a genuinely living historical memory considerably richer and considerably more detailed than any written archive, however extensive, could ever hope to independently preserve. A resource that shaped nearly every dimension of the sisterhood's remarkable, patient, multi-generational planning across the whole of their long and consequential history. The specific method by which individual ancestral memories could be consciously accessed and consulted, rather than simply existing as an overwhelming, undifferentiated background presence, required its own considerable practice to develop, experienced Reverend Mothers learning to direct their attention toward particular ancestral perspectives relevant to whatever specific question or specific circumstance currently demanded their consideration, treating other memory less like a single continuous voice and more like an enormous, navigable library of lived experience available for careful, deliberate consultation. Younger sisters preparing for their own eventual Reverend Mother transformation often studied accounts from those who had already successfully completed the ordeal, gathering whatever practical guidance previous transformations could offer regarding how to navigate the initial, disorienting flood of inherited memory, though every account emphasized that the actual, lived experience of receiving other memory for the first time exceeded anything second-hand description could adequately prepare a candidate to fully anticipate. Some Reverend Mothers described developing particular, ongoing relationships with specific ancestral perspectives they found themselves consulting more frequently than others, a kind of internal specialization that mirrored, in its own way, the specialization individual sisters developed in their external roles and external responsibilities, suggesting that even within the vast, shared inheritance of other memory, genuine individual personality and genuine individual preference continued shaping how each Reverend Mother actually experienced and actually used her extraordinary inheritance. The philosophical questions other memory raised regarding personal identity and continuity of self occupied considerable attention among Bene Gesserit scholars across the centuries. Since a Reverend Mother carrying the genuine, lived memory of countless women before her faced genuine, difficult questions about where her own individual identity actually ended and her vast inherited consciousness actually began. Questions the sisterhood's own extensive training worked carefully to help each new Reverend Mother navigate without losing her own essential, individual sense of self within the overwhelming scope of what she had inherited. A single mind, carrying within it the quiet, accumulated weight of an entire order's long, unbroken history. There is a particular kind of vertigo described consistently across surviving Reverend Mother testimony. The strange, disorienting sensation of suddenly possessing memories of childbirth, of death, of centuries of political intrigue, none of which had happened to the woman experiencing them in her own single, ordinary lifetime, and yet all of which now felt, undeniably and permanently, like genuinely her own. Sit with that image for a moment. An ordinary woman becoming, quite literally, a living continuation of everyone who walked this same path before her. And let it settle, the way the largest and strangest truths often need time to settle before we move forward once more. There is, in the end, a strange comfort embedded within other memory worth naming before we continue. The promise that nothing genuinely lived is ever entirely lost. That somewhere, carefully preserved within an unbroken chain of careful, patient women, every joy and every grief eventually finds a place to continue existing, long after the particular life that first experienced it has quietly come to its own natural end. Sisters who had lived with other memory for many years often described a gradual, hard-won shift in how the accumulated voices within them actually felt over time, moving from something closer to a crowded, occasionally overwhelming chorus in the earliest months, following transformation towards something considerably calmer and more organized, individual ancestral voices, offering guidance only when genuinely relevant, rather than constantly competing for the transformed sister's immediate attention. This gradual settling, rarely discussed openly outside the sisterhood's own most trusted internal circles, represented its own quiet, private discipline, layered on top of everything a new Reverend Mother had already needed to master, simply to survive her original transformation. Some Reverend Mothers describe the experience less as hearing individual ancestral voices and more as suddenly possessing a vast internal library of lived perspective, available for careful consultation whenever a genuinely difficult decision demanded wisdom no single lifetime, however carefully trained, could otherwise have supplied on its own. Up next in Chapter 12, the Kwisatz Haderach Project will uncover the full scope and full purpose of the genetic goal the sisterhood's entire breeding program had been working toward for so many generations. The Kwisatz Haderach Project represented the ultimate goal underlying the whole of the Bene Gesserit breeding index, this history examined several chapters ago, a genetic and psychological objective the sisterhood had pursued patiently across countless generations, working toward the eventual production of a male practitioner capable of accessing both the male and female lines of ancestral memory simultaneously. A capability that would grant him prescient awareness and inherited wisdom exceeding anything even the most accomplished Reverend Mother, bound entirely to her own maternal ancestral line, could ever independently achieve. The specific reasoning underlying why this particular capability required a male practitioner rather than simply another exceptionally trained female sister rested on the sisterhood's own careful genetic and psychological theory regarding how ancestral memory actually transmitted itself across generations, a theory suggesting that female practitioners could access only their own maternal ancestral line, while a sufficiently prepared male practitioner, given the right genetic preparation, might access both parental lines at once, achieving a synthesis of accumulated wisdom and accumulated perspective the sisterhood believed would prove genuinely transformative, both for the Kwisatz Haderach himself and for the wider Bene Gesserit project he was meant to ultimately serve. The sisterhood's own stated purpose for this project centered on producing a figure capable of guiding human civilization with a degree of accumulated wisdom and genuine prescient insight no single generation, working with only its own immediate knowledge and immediate perspective, could ever hope to independently achieve a genuinely ambitious civilizational project extending across centuries of careful, patient genetic work. Whether this stated purpose fully captured the sisterhood's actual, complete motivation, or whether additional considerations regarding institutional power and institutional control also shaped the project's underlying design, remains a question later. Historians studying Bene Gesserit history have continued to debate without ever reaching fully settled consensus. The project's careful, calculated timeline anticipated the eventual Kwisatz Haderach's birth occurring at a specific, carefully planned future generation. Following the precise pattern of arranged marriages and arranged pairings the sisterhood's breeding index had spent centuries carefully establishing, with Jessica's own planned marriage arrangements representing merely one crucial step within this much larger, much longer unfolding genetic plan, rather than its intended final conclusion. What actually occurred instead, when Jessica chose to bear Duke Leto a son rather than the daughter sisterhood instruction had explicitly required of her, represents one of history's most consequential examples of a carefully engineered multi-generational plan being disrupted by a single individual's personal choice, a disruption this history's companion account of the Atreides family has already examined in considerable detail, and one this account will continue to trace in the chapter immediately following this one. The sisterhood's own reaction to discovering that a Kwisatz Haderach had apparently emerged a full generation earlier than their own careful planning had intended reveals considerable insight into the genuine risk embedded within any sufficiently ambitious, sufficiently long-term genetic project. Even centuries of careful, patient calculation could not fully guarantee control over outcomes that ultimately depended, at every crucial step, on the personal choices of individual human beings whose own private motivations did not always align neatly with whatever larger institutional purpose their births had been carefully arranged to eventually serve. The project's name itself, Kwisatz Haderach, carried specific linguistic meaning within the older tradition the sisterhood drew upon in constructing much of their internal terminology, translating roughly to something like the shortening of the way, suggesting a figure capable of compressing what would otherwise require countless generations of gradual human development into a single, transformative individual lifetime, a conceptual framework that reveals just how ambitious and just how totalizing the sisterhood's own vision for this eventual figure's role actually was. Internal sisterhood debate regarding the wisdom and the ethics of the entire Kwisatz Haderach project persisted across the generations leading up to Paul's own birth, some senior sisters expressing genuine, documented concern about the risks of concentrating so much power and so much accumulated capability within a single individual, however carefully that individual's genetic preparation had been managed, concerns that would prove entirely justified once Paul's actual rise demonstrated exactly how difficult a fully realized Kwisatz Haderach proved to control or to guide according to the sisterhood's own original careful intentions. The specific genetic markers and specific ancestral combinations the sisterhood believed necessary to produce a viable Kwisatz Haderach candidate remained, even among the program's own senior architects, subject to considerable ongoing theoretical revision across the generations the project actually spanned. The sisterhood's own accumulating genetic data continuously refining their working theory regarding exactly which combinations of traits and exactly which specific bloodlines offered the most promising path toward their eventual, carefully calculated goal. Comparison between the Kwisatz Haderach project and other ambitious genetic and social engineering efforts documented across human history reveals both genuine parallel and genuine distinction. The sisterhood's own project, notable particularly for its extraordinary patience and extraordinary multi-generational scope, sustained consistently by an institution stable enough and disciplined enough to actually carry such an ambitious plan through to its eventual, consequential conclusion in ways few other human institutions across recorded history have ever successfully managed to achieve. Centuries of careful arithmetic, all converging quietly toward a single, still unborn child. It is worth asking, honestly, whether the sisterhood ever seriously questioned the wisdom of concentrating quite so much accumulated purpose into a single individual, however carefully bred. And the surviving record suggests they did, repeatedly. Across generations of internal debate that never quite managed to outweigh the project's own tremendous institutional momentum. A momentum built from centuries of accumulated sunk investment that made abandoning the plan feel, to each successive generation of sisterhood leadership, considerably harder than simply continuing to carry it forward one more careful step at a time. There is a lesson embedded here, quiet and worth carrying forward, about how easily even the most careful, most rational institutions can find themselves trapped by their own accumulated history, continuing down a path less because it still makes clear sense, and more because turning back would mean admitting how much had already, irreversibly, been invested in reaching this particular point along it. It is a lesson that extends far beyond any single genetic project, applicable to nearly any sufficiently ambitious, sufficiently long-term human endeavor. A quiet reminder worth carrying gently with you as sleep continues drawing closer. Outside observers, who eventually learned fragments of the breeding index's true scope, frequently asked the same obvious question, whether the sisterhood ever seriously considered abandoning a project whose full completion lay so many generations beyond any single participant's own working lifetime. Internal sisterhood records suggest this question was raised periodically across the centuries by individual Reverend Mothers themselves, and each time, the institutional answer remained essentially unchanged, that the project's enormous accumulated investment and enormous potential consequence made abandonment considerably riskier, by the sisterhood's own careful calculation, than continuing patiently forward toward whatever conclusion the work eventually reached. Later, Reverend Mothers, reviewing the breeding index's full historical arc, sometimes noted a further irony worth recording, that the very care and patience the sisterhood invested in controlling every variable across so many generations ultimately produced an outcome that escaped their control entirely the moment Jessica made her own choice. A reminder that even the most meticulously managed human systems remain, in the end, made up of individuals capable of choosing otherwise. Up next, in Chapter 13, Jessica's Disobedience, we'll uncover exactly why Jessica chose to defy her sisterhood's explicit instruction, and what that single, personal choice actually cost the whole of the wider Imperium. Jessica's decision to bear Duke Leto Atreides a son, rather than the daughter her Bene Gesserit training and her explicit sisterhood instruction had required of her, represents one of the most consequential single acts of personal defiance recorded anywhere within the whole of the Imperium's long, tangled history. A choice made from genuine love rather than from any calculated political or genetic ambition of her own, and one whose full consequences neither Jessica herself nor the wider sisterhood leadership fully understood until many years after the choice had already been made and could no longer be undone. The specific instruction Jessica defied required her to produce a daughter whose eventual marriage to a Harkonnen heir would complete the sisterhood's careful genetic plan for the Kwisatz Haderach precisely one generation later than what would actually occur. A plan Jessica understood clearly given her own extensive Bene Gesserit training and her own genuine, thorough familiarity with the sisterhood's larger genetic ambitions. Her choice to instead bear Leto the son he had long privately hoped for, reflected a deeply personal motivation, genuine love for a man who had never fully known why his house's Bene Gesserit concubine kept the specific nature of her reproductive choices so carefully private from him across their years together. This single act of maternal defiance meant that a Kwisatz Haderach candidate, carrying the accumulated genetic preparation of centuries of careful sisterhood breeding work, was born a full generation earlier than the sisterhood's own careful planning had intended, into circumstances the sisterhood had never specifically prepared or specifically anticipated for this crucial genetic outcome. Paul Atreides grew up not within the carefully controlled environment the sisterhood's own long-term plan would likely have arranged for their intended Kwisatz Haderach, but within the considerably more chaotic, considerably more genuinely dangerous circumstances of House Atreides' own political fortunes. Circumstances that included his father's assassination and his own desperate flight into the Arrakeen Desert at an age when a more carefully planned Kwisatz Haderach candidate would likely have still been receiving controlled, protected sisterhood preparation. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam's own reaction upon discovering the true nature of Jessica's defiance, revealed during her formal testing of young Paul, this history will examine in a later chapter, combined genuine professional alarm at the disruption to decades of careful genetic planning, with a grudging, considerable respect for the sheer, unprecedented capability Paul nonetheless displayed during his own testing, suggesting that whatever else Jessica's defiance had cost the sisterhood's carefully calculated timeline, it had not prevented the production of a genuinely remarkable, genuinely capable Kwisatz Haderach candidate, merely one arriving considerably earlier and considerably less controlled than the sisterhood's own patient planning had originally intended. Jessica herself carried the full weight of this consequential choice across the whole of her subsequent life, watching her son grow into a figure whose eventual rise and eventual jihad would reshape the entire Imperium. Uncertain across many of those same years whether her own personal choice, made from genuine love rather than any careful political calculation, had ultimately served humanity well, or had instead unleashed exactly the kind of uncontrolled, unpredictable outcome the sisterhood's own careful, patient breeding program had been specifically designed across centuries to prevent. The broader lesson this particular episode offers regarding the Bene Gesserit sisterhood's actual, practical limitations deserves careful acknowledgement within this history. For all their genuine sophistication in genetic planning, political influence, and psychological training, the sisterhood remained, in the end, dependent on the cooperation and the personal choices of individual women whose own private hearts did not always align neatly with whatever larger institutional purpose centuries of careful planning had assigned to their particular role within the sisterhood's much larger, much longer unfolding genetic project. The considerable difference between how Paul actually developed, raised largely by his mother and by Duke Leto's trusted household, rather than within any formal sisterhood institutional structure, and how a properly planned Kwisatz Haderach candidate would likely have been raised under direct sisterhood guidance, shaped much of what made Paul genuinely unpredictable from the sisterhood's own institutional perspective. He grew up with genuine, deep personal loyalty to people entirely outside sisterhood control, to his father, to Gurney Halleck, to Duncan Idaho. Attachments that gave him motivations and considerations a more carefully controlled upbringing might never have permitted to develop with anything like the same intensity or the same personal significance. Jessica herself, reflecting later in life on her own consequential choice, reportedly maintained that she would make the same decision again if given the opportunity, a testament to the genuine, considered conviction underlying her original defiance, rather than any simple, impulsive maternal preference she came to regret once its full historical consequences became clear across the years and decades that followed Paul's own extraordinary rise. Historians examining this episode across the generations since have sometimes framed Jessica's choice as a simple romantic gesture, love overriding duty, in the manner of countless older stories, though this framing likely understates the genuine, considered nature of her decision, made by a woman whose extensive Bene Gesserit training gave her full, clear understanding of exactly what she was risking and exactly what the sisterhood's careful planning actually required of her. A choice made with open eyes rather than simple, impulsive sentiment. The ripple effects of Jessica's decision extended into details the sisterhood's own careful planning had never specifically anticipated, including the particular circumstances of Alia's own preborn condition, conceived during Jessica's water of life transformation while pregnant, a genuinely unprecedented biological circumstance that emerged directly from the same chain of consequential personal choices Jessica had set into motion years earlier through her original decision regarding Paul's own birth. One quiet choice, made from love rather than obedience, and an entire carefully calculated future quietly rewrote itself around it. The sisterhood would spend decades reckoning with exactly how much that single choice had actually cost them, and exactly how much. In ways none of them could have anticipated, it had also given the wider Imperium in return. Somewhere in that same quiet decision, made in the privacy of a bedroom on a green and distant world, lay the true, if entirely unintended, seed of everything that would eventually follow. A jihad, a golden path, a scattering, an entire reshaping of human civilization across thousands of years, all traceable back to one woman's choice to finally, for once, put her own heart ahead of her own careful, extensive training. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, in the fact that history's largest turns so often trace back not to grand strategy or careful calculation, but to small, private, deeply human choices made by people who could never have fully known, in the moment of choosing, just how far the consequences would eventually travel, or how many other lives, on how many other worlds, they would eventually come to touch. Perhaps this is simply the truest lesson any long history like this one can ever really offer, that the smallest, most private choices often carry the largest, most far-reaching weight, however impossible that weight might have seemed in the quiet, ordinary moment the choice itself was actually made. Jessica herself, in the fragments of later reflection that survive her, apparently understood the full weight of what she had chosen long before anyone else around her fully grasped its consequences, carrying that private knowledge quietly through years in which the choice's true significance remained invisible to everyone but her. That particular kind of solitary foresight, knowing a consequential truth that cannot yet be shared or even fully explained, represents its own considerable burden. One this history suspects many Bene Gesserit sisters across many generations came to know intimately in their own quieter, less dramatically recorded ways. Historians examining this single decision centuries later continued to find it worth returning to, precisely because it resisted easy categorization, neither pure rebellion nor pure accident, but something closer to a private act of love whose full institutional consequence its author could not possibly have calculated in the moment she actually made it. Up next, in Chapter 14, the Sisterhood's Long Game with House Atreides will uncover the full, careful history of Bene Gesserit involvement with the Atreides bloodline across the generations, leading up to Paul's own consequential birth. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood's involvement with House Atreides extended back across generations before Jessica's own birth, part of the same careful, patient genetic planning that shaped noble marriages and noble pairings across the whole of the Imperium in service of the sisterhood's larger Kwisatz Haderach project. House Atreides, with its own long and carefully maintained reputation for genuine leadership capability and genuine political skill, represented exactly the kind of bloodline the sisterhood's careful genetic calculations identified as valuable to their broader breeding program, worth cultivating and worth carefully guiding across multiple successive generations. Jessica's own placement within Duke Leto's household as his official concubine, rather than his formally married wife, reflected careful sisterhood calculation regarding exactly how to position their own bred and trained agent within House Atreides, in a manner that preserved maximum flexibility for the sisterhood's own larger genetic planning. Since a formal marriage would have carried political and inheritance implications, the sisterhood preferred to avoid complicating their own careful, ongoing genetic project with. This arrangement, whatever its practical political convenience for the sisterhood's own purposes, nonetheless developed into a relationship of genuine, deep affection between Jessica and Leto, a personal outcome the sisterhood's own calculated positioning had not specifically intended, but that ultimately shaped the consequential choices Jessica would eventually make regarding her own children's births. The sisterhood's broader interest in House Atreides extended beyond simply Jessica's own individual placement, involving careful, ongoing observation of the wider Atreides political fortunes and the wider Atreides reputation across the Landsraad, since a bloodline's genetic value to the sisterhood's long-term project depended partly on that bloodline's continued political relevance and continued survival across the generations still required to eventually complete their careful genetic planning. This meant the sisterhood maintained genuine, sustained institutional interest in House Atreides' political fate long before Jessica's own arrival within Leto's household, and would continue that same careful attention long after the dramatic events surrounding the family's move to Arrakis had reshaped the entire Imperium's political landscape. Duke Leto's own relationship with the wider Bene Gesserit sisterhood, mediated primarily through his relationship with Jessica herself, remained considerably more distant and considerably less informed than Jessica's own deep, thorough understanding of the sisterhood's true purposes and true methods. A gap in understanding that meant Leto navigated much of his own house's fate without full awareness of exactly how thoroughly Bene Gesserit genetic planning had shaped the circumstances of his own family's most intimate relationships and most consequential decisions. The careful, patient timeline the sisterhood had originally planned for House Atreides' role within their larger genetic project assumed a level of continued stability and continued institutional control that the actual, dramatic events of Leto's assassination and his family's desperate flight into the Arrakeen Desert completely disrupted, forcing the sisterhood's own leadership to reckon. In real time and without the careful, controlled circumstances their planning had originally anticipated, with exactly how their long-cultivated Atreides bloodline would actually develop under genuinely chaotic and genuinely dangerous circumstances no prior generation of careful sisterhood planning had specifically prepared for. This particular episode in Bene Gesserit history illustrates, with unusual clarity, the genuine tension running throughout the whole of the sisterhood's careful, patient institutional approach. A genuine talent for long-term genetic and political planning that nonetheless remained, in the end, vulnerable to the same kind of sudden, unpredictable historical disruption that shaped the fortunes of every other great house and every other institution across the whole of the wider Imperium's long and often violent history. Thufir Hawat, House Atreides' own Mentat advisor, maintained his own careful, professionally cautious relationship with the various Bene Gesserit agents and Bene Gesserit interests connected to Jessica's presence within the household, understanding through his own extensive Mentat training that a sisterhood-placed advisor, however genuinely devoted to House Atreides she might have personally become, ultimately answered to institutional loyalties Hawat himself could never fully verify. or fully trust. A professional wariness that placed him among the very few members of Leto's household who approached Jessica's presence with anything resembling genuine, sustained suspicion. The broader pattern of Bene Gesserit placement within noble households across the Imperium, of which Jessica's own position represented merely one particularly consequential example, reflected a systematic institutional strategy extending across countless great houses simultaneously, ensuring sisterhood presence and sisterhood influence within the private, intimate spaces of imperial political power, where the most consequential decisions regarding marriage, inheritance, and political alliance were actually made. House Atreides' own historical relationship with the wider Bene Gesserit sisterhood extended back generations before Jessica's own arrival, previous Atreides dukes maintaining their own careful, if considerably less intimate, connections with individual sisters serving as advisors or consultants across the family's long political history, meaning Jessica's placement within Leto's household continued rather than initiated a pattern of Bene Gesserit involvement with House Atreides that had already shaped the family's fortunes in smaller, less dramatic ways across previous generations. The particular value House Atreides held within the sisterhood's own genetic calculations extended beyond simple political prominence. Connecting to specific inherited traits, the sisterhood's accumulated data suggested ran unusually strong within the Atreides bloodline, a combination of psychological resilience and natural leadership capability, the sisterhood's own careful genetic theory, identified as particularly valuable to their broader patient breeding program's eventual goals. All of it, generations of careful placement and careful patience, converging quietly on a single household on a single, distant, water-rich world, waiting for history to finally arrive and claim it. Long games, by their very nature, rarely announce themselves clearly to the people actually living inside them, and House Atreides itself, for all its genuine prominence across the Landsraad, remained largely unaware of just how thoroughly and just how patiently the sisterhood's careful attention had already shaped the family's most intimate circumstances long before Duke Leto's own fateful decision to accept stewardship over Arrakis ever set the family's more visible, more dramatic history into motion. Consider how strange it must have been for Leto himself, had he ever fully understood it, to learn that the woman he loved, the mother of his children, had come to him not entirely by her own free wandering, but through careful, patient calculation reaching back generations before either of them had ever been born. A love genuine and real, built nonetheless on foundations neither of them had originally chosen for themselves. Genealogy, in the sisterhood's own careful hands, became something closer to a living instrument than a simple record of the past. An ongoing, actively played composition whose full melody no single generation could ever hear complete, only contribute their own small, careful note toward, trusting the whole to eventually resolve itself across a span of time none of them would personally live to witness. House Atreides itself, unaware of quite how thoroughly its own story had already been woven into this much older, much larger composition, continued forward believing itself simply the author of its own fate, an illusion this history has already begun, gently, to complicate. The sisterhood's patient cultivation of House Atreides extended across considerably more generations than most casual observers of imperial politics ever recognized, involving careful marriages, careful advisory placements, and careful genetic tracking stretching back long before Duke Leto, or even his own father, had ever been born. Each generation's contribution seemingly modest in isolation, but cumulatively decisive when viewed across the entire span the sisterhood's own patient records actually covered. Viewed from within the sisterhood itself, this patient, generations-long cultivation of a single noble house represented neither cynicism nor genuine affection, but something harder to name cleanly. A careful, professional investment that nonetheless required individual sisters across many decades to form real relationships, real loyalties, and occasionally real conflicts of conscience with the very family whose fate their own institutional planning was quietly, patiently shaping from a considerable distance. Up next in Chapter 15, Gaius Helen Mohiam and the Gom Jabbar will uncover the formal sisterhood testing young Paul underwent, and exactly what that dangerous trial was actually designed to determine. Gaius Helen Mohiam, the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, serving as the sisterhood's own truthsayer at the imperial court, arrived at Caledon specifically to formally test young Paul Atreides using an instrument called the Gom Jabbar, a poisoned needle capable of killing instantly, held against the subject's neck throughout a trial designed to determine whether the boy possessed genuine human self-mastery or was, in the sisterhood's own careful terminology, merely an animal governed entirely by instinct and incapable of overriding pain and fear through conscious, disciplined will. The trial itself required Paul to place his hand inside a small box capable of generating excruciating nerve pain, sensation the box produced through direct neural stimulation without causing any genuine physical damage to the hand itself, while Mohiam held the poisoned needle steady against his neck, ready to kill him instantly should he withdraw his hand from the box before the test concluded. This combination of genuine physical agony and genuine mortal stakes created circumstances few subjects at any age could reliably endure without their instinctive, animal panic overwhelming whatever conscious discipline they might otherwise have believed themselves to possess. Paul endured the entire ordeal without withdrawing his hand, drawing on the same litany against fear his mother had taught him, despite this teaching violating strict sisterhood protocol, reserving such instruction for properly trained sisters rather than for a young boy whose formal Bene Gesserit education, by rights, should never have included this particular discipline at all. His successful endurance proved, beyond any reasonable doubt available to Mohiam's own considerable expertise in evaluating exactly this kind of trial, that Paul possessed genuine human self-mastery, considerably exceeding what most fully grown adults, let alone a boy his particular age, would typically demonstrate under equivalent circumstances. Mohiam's own reaction to this successful test result carried genuine complexity that this history has already begun to trace in earlier chapters, combining professional alarm at discovering a Kwisatz Haderach candidate, displaying this level of capability a full generation earlier than the sisterhood's own careful breeding timeline had anticipated, with a grudging, considerable respect for the sheer, unprecedented nature of what she had just personally witnessed. Her subsequent report back to the wider sisterhood leadership regarding Paul's testing results set into motion increasingly urgent Bene Gesserit attention toward monitoring, and, where genuinely possible, attempting to influence the trajectory of this unexpectedly early and unexpectedly powerful Kwisatz Haderach candidate. The formal purpose of the Gom Jabbar testing within wider Bene Gesserit practice extended beyond simply evaluating Paul's own particular case, representing a standard trial the sisterhood applied, in various forms, to evaluate genuine human capability across many different contexts throughout their long institutional history. A practical, if genuinely dangerous, method for determining whether a given subject possessed the kind of disciplined self-mastery the sisterhood's broader genetic and political ambitions ultimately depended upon identifying accurately and reliably. The considerable risk embedded within this particular testing method, risking the subject's actual death should they fail to demonstrate sufficient self-control, reflects the same underlying sisterhood philosophy this history has already traced across earlier chapters regarding fear and discipline, genuine capability could only be reliably confirmed through genuinely dangerous, genuinely consequential trial, since any test lacking real stakes could never adequately distinguish between a subject's claimed self-mastery and the kind of self-mastery that actually held firm when a person's own life genuinely, immediately depended upon it. Mohiam's own private thoughts during the testing itself, insofar as later accounts and her own subsequent reports allow us to reconstruct them, reveal a woman caught between rigid professional duty and genuine, growing unease at what she was witnessing unfold in front of her. Watching a boy considerably younger than any prior Kwisatz Haderach candidate the sisterhood had ever directly tested demonstrate capability that exceeded, by a considerable margin, what her own extensive experience evaluating countless previous subjects across her long career had ever led her to expect from someone his particular age. The Gom Jabbar itself, the poisoned needle Mohiam held ready throughout the entire ordeal, represented standard Bene Gesserit equipment carried by truthsayers and testing sisters across the whole of the Imperium, a tool whose mere presence during any formal sisterhood evaluation communicated clearly to anyone familiar with Bene Gesserit practice exactly how seriously and exactly how dangerously the Order treated the question of genuine human self-mastery. There is something worth remembering about that afternoon on Caladan, an ordinary-looking room, a mother watching quietly from a nearby doorway, and a boy who did not yet know that the whole of his own extraordinary future had already, in some sense, begun the moment he chose not to pull his hand away. The box itself, generating pain through direct neural stimulation without genuine tissue damage, represented a piece of specialized Bene Gesserit technology, developed and refined across generations specifically for this exact testing purpose, engineered to produce sensation intense enough to trigger genuine involuntary panic in an untrained subject while leaving no lasting physical injury behind, regardless of how the test itself ultimately concluded. A careful, deliberate calibration reflecting the sisterhood's own considerable technical sophistication applied even to this single, specific instrument of evaluation. Paul's own recollection of the testing, shared only in fragments across his later life, described an experience of genuine, total agony that pushed his own considerable discipline to its absolute limit, offering this history a valuable first-hand perspective on just how demanding the trial actually proved to be, even for someone who ultimately succeeded, a reminder that his success reflected genuine, extraordinary capability rather than any exaggeration in how thoroughly documented accounts of the test's severity have generally described its intensity. A needle held steady, a hand kept perfectly still, and a boy who proved, in the space of a few unbearable minutes, that he was something the sisterhood had never quite planned to meet this soon. There is something genuinely striking, examined honestly, about an institution willing to risk a child's death simply to confirm what they already suspected, and something equally striking about a mother willing to stand nearby and allow that risk to unfold, both of them bound by a discipline that treated even the deepest personal love as something to be carefully weighed against the larger, colder demands of institutional necessity. And yet, whatever discomfort this history has tried to name honestly, the trial itself revealed something genuinely true about Paul, a capability that was not manufactured or exaggerated, but real, tested under the most severe possible circumstances, exactly the kind of evidence the sisterhood's entire careful methodology was built to demand before believing anything at all. Whatever else might be said about the ethics of that particular afternoon, the boy who walked away from it had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly what everyone present most needed and most feared to learn. Accounts of the Gom Jabbar testing that survive from other, less famous candidates across Bene Gesserit history suggest Paul's experience, however exceptional in its outcome, followed a testing procedure that had remained essentially unchanged for generations. The same box, the same needle, the same quiet, watchful Reverend Mother administering a trial whose fundamental design the sisterhood had, long since concluded, could not be meaningfully improved upon without compromising its actual diagnostic value. Up next in Chapter 16, what the sisterhood actually feared about Paul, we'll uncover exactly why Paul's successful testing and subsequent rise troubled the wider Bene Gesserit leadership so considerably. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood's growing alarm as Paul Atreides' capability and Paul Atreides' influence continued expanding across his years among the Fremen rested on a specific, carefully reasoned fear that extended considerably beyond simple concern about their genetic timeline being disrupted a generation early. The sisterhood understood, through centuries of accumulated experience managing carefully controlled political and genetic influence across the Imperium, that a Kwisatz Haderach operating entirely outside their own institutional guidance represented a genuinely unprecedented and genuinely dangerous variable. A figure possessing capability the sisterhood themselves had worked centuries to cultivate, now answering to no authority beyond his own judgment and the increasingly fervent Fremen religious devotion building around him. This fear crystallized specifically around the question of control. Every other significant Bene Gesserit achievement this history has examined across earlier chapters, the voice, prana bindu mastery, truth-saying, other memory, remained firmly within sisterhood institutional structure, developed and deployed by sisters who remained accountable to the wider order's own leadership and own long-term strategic purpose. Paul represented something categorically different, a Kwisatz Haderach candidate raised largely outside direct sisterhood control, trained partially by his mother in violation of strict protocol, and increasingly embedded within a Fremen religious and political movement the sisterhood's own Missionaria Protectiva had originally seeded but had never intended to actually produce a genuine, historically consequential messianic leader commanding real military power. The specific danger the sisterhood identified extended beyond Paul's own individual choices to the broader structural problem his rise illustrated. A sufficiently capable, prescient figure, once he achieved genuine religious devotion and genuine military capability, could reshape the entire Imperium's trajectory in ways no amount of careful, patient sisterhood planning could adequately anticipate or adequately counter. This concern would prove entirely justified once Paul's rise culminated in the devastating jihad this history's companion accounts have already examined extensively, a catastrophe measured in billions of lives that confirmed, in the most consequential and most tragic way imaginable, exactly the kind of uncontrolled outcome the sisterhood's own centuries of careful genetic and political planning had always been specifically designed to prevent. Bene Gesserit attempts to influence or moderate Paul's rise once his capability became fully apparent met with limited success, since Paul's own prescient awareness, considerably exceeding what any single Reverend Mother could independently match, gave him genuine insight into sisterhood intentions and sisterhood methods that made him difficult to manipulate through the kinds of careful, indirect influence the sisterhood had relied upon successfully across so many other political situations throughout their long institutional history. This represented a genuinely novel challenge for an order that had spent centuries perfecting methods of patient, largely invisible influence over subjects who lacked any comparable insight into the sisterhood's own careful, hidden methods and hidden purposes. The wider political relationship between the sisterhood and Paul's eventual imperial rule remained genuinely uneasy throughout the whole of his reign, the sisterhood maintaining careful, watchful presence within his court. while privately continuing to regard his rise as a genuine cautionary example of exactly the kind of uncontrolled prescient authority their own careful institutional discipline had always worked to prevent rather than to actually produce, whatever their own centuries of patient breeding work had ultimately, if unintentionally, contributed toward making possible. This particular episode in Bene Gesserit history would go on to shape the sisterhood's own subsequent institutional caution for generations following Paul's eventual death, a lesson in the genuine risk embedded within their own most ambitious genetic project that later sisterhood leadership, including those managing the order's own complicated relationship with Paul's son Leto II, would carry forward carefully into every subsequent decision regarding their continued, if considerably more cautious, engagement with the Atreides bloodline's continuing role within the wider Imperium's unfolding history. Individual Reverend Mothers across the sisterhood's wider leadership held varying private opinions regarding exactly how much responsibility their own centuries of careful genetic and religious planning actually bore for the catastrophic scale of Paul's eventual jihad. Some arguing the outcome represented an unforeseeable, tragic accident arising from Jessica's own unauthorized choice, rather than any flaw in the sisterhood's original planning. Others arguing more uncomfortably that the entire Kwisatz Haderach project had always carried this exact risk embedded within its fundamental design, regardless of which particular generation eventually produced the figure their careful breeding work had been working toward all along. This internal disagreement, never fully resolved even generations later, illustrates something important about the sisterhood's own capacity for genuine institutional self-reflection. An order willing to honestly examine its own potential culpability in genuine historical catastrophe, rather than simply retreating into comfortable, self-serving explanation. A quality this history has found reason to note favorably, even while acknowledging the genuine, serious ethical questions the sisterhood's own methods continued to raise across the whole of their long institutional history. Comparative analysis conducted by later sisterhood scholars, drawing on the full historical record once Paul's reign and its consequences had run their complete course, identified several specific structural factors that made his particular rise so uniquely difficult for the sisterhood to influence or moderate, including his unusually early awakening to full prescient capability, his deep personal integration into Fremen culture and Fremen religious devotion, rather than any comparable integration into sisterhood institutional structure, and his own mother's genuine, complicating personal loyalty to him over her formal sisterhood obligations. These structural lessons directly informed later sisterhood strategy regarding how to manage their relationship with subsequent powerful figures, particularly Paul's own son, Leto. The sisterhood's leadership working consciously to avoid repeating the same specific pattern of losing early influence and early access that had proven so costly and so difficult to recover from during Paul's own initial, unexpected rise to power. A candidate they had spent centuries preparing to eventually guide, arriving instead already fully grown into something none of them could steer. Perhaps the deepest irony of all is that the sisterhood's own genuine fear regarding Paul proved entirely correct, and their genuine inability to prevent what they feared proved just as complete, a rare, humbling instance of an institution built almost entirely around careful, patient foresight, watching its own worst prediction unfold exactly as anticipated, without any of their considerable accumulated capability proving sufficient to actually stop it. There is something almost tragic in watching an institution recognize a danger clearly, name it accurately, and still find itself entirely unable to prevent it, a particular kind of powerlessness that no amount of accumulated wisdom or accumulated foresight ever fully protects against once events have already gathered enough of their own independent momentum. Perhaps the deepest lesson this particular episode offers is simply this, that even the most sophisticated foresight in the universe cannot substitute for genuine, sustained power to act, and that seeing danger clearly, however impressive an achievement in its own right, is never quite the same thing as being able to prevent it. This same tension between seeing clearly and acting effectively recurred throughout the sisterhood's own long institutional history informs considerably less dramatic than Paul's holy war. Senior Reverend Mothers repeatedly discovering that accurate prediction alone rarely translated automatically into the kind of practical influence their careful calculations might otherwise have suggested, was achievable, a humbling lesson the order seems to have needed to relearn, in one form or another, across nearly every generation that faced a genuinely unprecedented crisis. The sisterhood's own subsequent internal review of this entire episode concluded, with characteristic candor, that no amount of additional foresight training could have meaningfully altered the outcome. A rare admission from an institution that otherwise placed enormous confidence in the practical value of its own carefully accumulated predictive expertise. Up next, in Chapter 17, Adapting After the Jihad, we'll uncover how the sisterhood rebuilt and reconsidered its own methods in the difficult years following Paul's devastating holy war. In the years following Paul's devastating jihad, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood faced genuine, difficult institutional reckoning with exactly how thoroughly their own centuries of careful genetic and religious planning had contributed, however unintentionally, to a catastrophe measured in billions of lives lost across the whole of the Imperium. This reckoning did not produce any single dramatic transformation of sisterhood method or sisterhood purpose, but rather a slow, careful reconsideration of specific practices, particularly regarding the Missionaria Protectiva and the breeding index, that had proven capable of producing consequences considerably beyond what their original architects had ever intended or anticipated. The sisterhood's relationship with Paul's own regency period, managed by his sister Aliyah following his eventual disappearance into the desert, remained genuinely complicated, the sisterhood maintaining careful diplomatic presence within the regency court, while privately continuing to regard the entire Atreides genetic lineage with a mixture of genuine scientific interest and genuine institutional caution, watching closely as Paul's own children, the twins Leto and Ghanima, displayed their own extraordinary and genuinely concerning capabilities connected to their unusual preborn inheritance. Individual sisters serving within various roles across the post-jihad Imperium worked carefully to help rebuild political and social stability across worlds devastated by Paul's holy war. Drawing on the sisterhood's own considerable diplomatic and administrative expertise to assist in reconstruction efforts that extended well beyond any narrow sisterhood self-interest, a genuine humanitarian contribution that later historians studying this difficult period have generally credited to the sisterhood's broader institutional character. Whatever complicated role their own earlier genetic and religious planning had played in creating the very devastation their later efforts worked to help repair. The emergence of Leto II as an even more extraordinary and even more consequential figure than his own father, culminating in his extraordinary transformation and his 3,500-year reign as God Emperor, presented the sisterhood with an entirely new and entirely unprecedented set of institutional challenges, forcing them to develop genuinely new frameworks for understanding and, where possible, influencing a ruler whose own prescient capability and whose own transformed nature considerably exceeded even the concerning capability Paul himself had once displayed during his own more limited reign. The sisterhood's careful, ongoing efforts to maintain relevance and maintain some meaningful degree of continued institutional influence throughout the whole of Leto's extraordinarily long reign required considerable adaptation of methods that had served them reliably across many previous centuries since Leto's own prescient awareness and Leto's own careful, calculated governance style made him considerably more difficult to influence through conventional Bene Gesserit technique than any previous ruler the sisterhood had ever needed to navigate their relationship with. This long, difficult period of adaptation, extending across both Paul's own reign and his son's considerably longer and considerably stranger rule, taught the sisterhood valuable lessons about the genuine limits of their own careful, patient influence when facing prescient authority operating at a scale their own centuries of institutional experience had never previously encountered. Lessons that would prove essential preparation for the even greater challenge still awaiting them in the centuries following Leto's own eventual, carefully orchestrated death. The sisterhood's own careful, ongoing study of Paul's methods and Paul's mistakes during this reconstruction period fed directly into how they eventually approached his son, Leto's own extraordinary reign. Senior Reverend Mothers, drawing consciously on lessons from Paul's own jihad when developing strategies for navigating a relationship with an even more powerful and even more difficult to influence prescient authority, applying hard-won institutional wisdom in ways that reflected genuine organizational learning rather than simple repetition of prior approach. Individual sisters who had lived through and personally witnessed the worst of Paul's jihad carried their own private grief and private reckoning forward across the remainder of their careers, some choosing to specialize increasingly in humanitarian and reconstruction work, specifically because of what they had witnessed, a personal response to institutional catastrophe that added its own quiet, human dimension to the sisterhood's broader, more calculated institutional adaptation during this difficult period. Specific programs the sisterhood developed during this reconstruction period, offering trained medical, psychological, and administrative assistance to devastated worlds across the former battlegrounds of Paul's jihad, drew heavily on capabilities this history examined in earlier chapters. Prana Bindu, trained healers proving genuinely valuable in treating trauma the war's survivors carried forward, while truth-saying skill helped rebuild trust in shattered local governance structures desperately in need of reliable, credible arbitration during their own difficult recovery. The sisterhood's own internal archives from this period record considerable debate regarding how openly to acknowledge their institutional role in events leading up to the jihad. Some senior sisters advocating for greater transparency as both an ethical obligation and a practical trust-building measure. Others warning that public acknowledgement of sisterhood involvement in seeding the very prophecy that fueled Paul's rise risked generating dangerous backlash against an order already viewed with considerable suspicion across much of the wounded, grieving Imperium. Slowly, patiently, the sisterhood rebuilt what it could and quietly carried the rest of the weight forward, unspoken, into everything they did next. That the sisterhood chose reconstruction and honest reckoning over simple denial or simple retreat says something genuinely important about their own institutional character. An order capable of genuine grief, genuine responsibility, and genuine, patient repair. Qualities that sit uneasily but honestly alongside everything else this history has already traced regarding their more calculating, more instrumentalizing tendencies across the whole of their long, complicated history. Picture, if you can, the particular exhaustion of an institution measured not in years, but in the sheer, patient weight of generation after generation working to repair damage none of them had personally caused, carrying forward a debt they had inherited rather than incurred, and choosing, again and again, to keep paying it down regardless. And so, world by world, community by community, the sisterhood set about the long, unglamorous work of simply helping people rebuild ordinary lives, a labor considerably less dramatic than anything else this history has traced tonight, and perhaps, in its own quiet way, considerably more genuinely admirable than any of it. History rarely remembers this kind of patient, unglamorous labor with the same attention it reserves for battles and betrayals, and yet it is very often this same quiet, unglamorous labor that determines whether a shattered world ever actually finds its way back towards something resembling genuine peace. Sisters assigned to this patient, unglamorous rebuilding work across shattered worlds rarely received the kind of institutional recognition granted to those involved in more dramatic sisterhood undertakings. Yet the wider order came to understand, gradually and through hard-earned experience, that this quiet labor mattered every bit as much to the sisterhood's long-term survival as any single dramatic political intervention elsewhere across the Imperium. A community that trusted its own local Reverend Mother earned patiently across years of unglamorous, reliable service proved consistently more valuable to the wider sisterhood than a dozen more visible but more fragile alliances built quickly and abandoned just as quickly once circumstances shifted. Local populations who benefited from this patient rebuilding work rarely knew the full institutional apparatus standing behind the quiet sister, who had simply, reliably, kept showing up. And the sisterhood itself seemed largely content to let that particular credit remain invisible, so long as the underlying work itself continued steadily forward. Up next in Chapter 18, The War Against the Honored Matres, we'll uncover the desperate existential conflict that finally tested the sisterhood's accumulated capability against an enemy unlike anything their long history had ever previously prepared them to face. The centuries following Leto II's carefully orchestrated death brought the Bene Gesserit sisterhood face to face with the most genuinely existential threat their entire long institutional history had ever encountered. The Honored Matres, a group of women descended from Bene Gesserit training methods carried outward by sisters who had joined the Great Scattering following Leto's death, whose long isolation beyond the boundaries of the old Imperium had transformed their inherited sisterhood discipline into something considerably more aggressive and considerably less restrained than anything the core sisterhood itself still practiced. The specific techniques the Honored Matres had developed during their long exile, particularly a form of sexual and psychological control considerably more total and considerably more immediately overwhelming than anything traditional Bene Gesserit training had ever cultivated, presented the sisterhood with an opponent whose capability drew on genuinely related methods while abandoning the careful restraint and careful ethical consideration that had always distinguished authentic Bene Gesserit practice from simple exploitative manipulation of the kind the Honored Matres now wielded without apparent hesitation across their brutal campaign of conquest. This conflict forced considerable Bene Gesserit institutional adaptation, the sisterhood's own leadership recognizing that conventional resistance alone could not adequately withstand the Honored Matres' overwhelming aggression, pursuing increasingly unconventional strategies, including careful, uneasy cooperation with their own longtime rivals, the secretive Tleilaxu, whose unique genetic technology offered capabilities the sisterhood's own, more traditional methods could not independently replicate, but that proved genuinely valuable in developing effective resistance against an enemy whose own capabilities exceeded conventional Bene Gesserit technique. In ways centuries of prior institutional experience had never adequately prepared them to counter. Individual sisters distinguished themselves considerably during this difficult extended conflict, including the formidable Mother Superior Odrade, whose bold, unconventional leadership decisions proved essential to the sisterhood's continued survival. and Miles Tegg, whose own extraordinary transformation following honored matra torture and captivity granted him superhuman capabilities that provided crucial tactical advantage during several significant engagements across the long, costly war. The genuine, considerable uncertainty surrounding the war's eventual outcome and the Sisterhood's own desperate decision to begin transforming their secret home world of Chapterhouse into a new desert planet capable of once again sustaining sandworms and producing spice independent of any territory the honored matchers might otherwise control, represents this history's clearest illustration yet of just how far the Sisterhood was ultimately willing to go, sacrificing their own long-settled homeworld's established infrastructure in order to secure their continued institutional survival against a threat that had already claimed countless other worlds and countless other communities across the whole of the former Imperium's scattered territory. This extended, existential conflict, still genuinely unresolved by the time Frank Herbert's own written account of Dune's complete history reaches its final, deliberately open conclusion, represents the fullest and most demanding test the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood's accumulated centuries of discipline, patience, and careful institutional adaptation had ever faced. A genuine reckoning with exactly how much their traditional methods, however sophisticated, could actually accomplish against an enemy willing to abandon every ethical restraint the Sisterhood itself had always considered essential to their own genuine, disciplined identity. The initial contact between Bene Gesserit forces and the returning honored matress caught the Sisterhood genuinely unprepared, their own extensive intelligence gathering across the centuries of the scattering having failed to anticipate the scale or the aggression of what was actually returning from beyond the old Imperium's boundaries. A genuine intelligence failure that forced rapid, difficult institutional adaptation under the worst possible circumstances, actual, ongoing military crisis rather than the careful, patient planning the Sisterhood's own institutional culture had always preferred to rely upon. The particular horror Bene Gesserit observers reported upon first witnessing genuine honored matra combat and control technique in action centered specifically on how thoroughly the honored matras had abandoned the ethical restraint that had always distinguished authentic sisterhood practice, using their inherited capabilities with a totality and a coldness that even hardened experienced Reverend Mothers found genuinely disturbing to witness firsthand, a reaction that itself testified to how deeply the Sisterhood's own careful ethical training had shaped their expectations regarding how such capabilities ought to be responsibly deployed. Bene Gesserit's strategic planning during the earliest years of open conflict focused heavily on gathering reliable intelligence regarding honored matra capability and honored matra organization, a task complicated considerably by how thoroughly the returning group had transformed during their long isolation, meaning much of what the Sisterhood thought they understood about their own distant relatives, based on centuries-old records of the original scattering emigrants, proved dangerously outdated once genuine, sustained contact and genuine, sustained conflict actually began in earnest. The considerable losses the Sisterhood suffered across the war's early years forced increasingly difficult strategic choices regarding which worlds and which communities could realistically be defended against the honored matress's overwhelming aggression, and which needed to be abandoned in service of preserving the Sisterhood's own core institutional survival. Decisions that carried genuine moral weight for leadership forced to weigh immediate humanitarian obligation against the longer-term survival of everything the Sisterhood's centuries of accumulated knowledge and accumulated tradition actually represented. An enemy born, in some strange and distant sense, from their own oldest methods, now turned back against them with none of the restraint that had always made those methods bearable. Consider the strange, humbling position the sisterhood found itself in during these darkest years of the war. An order that had spent centuries carefully studying and carefully cultivating exactly the kinds of psychological and physiological technique the honored maîtres now wielded against them, forced to reckon with the fact that their own careful ethical restraint, the very quality that had always distinguished genuine Bene Gesserit practice from simple exploitation, might also be precisely what left them vulnerable against an enemy who had abandoned that same restraint entirely. And so the sisterhood found itself, after centuries of carefully guarding and carefully refining a discipline built on genuine restraint, fighting for its very survival against an enemy that had simply, deliberately, thrown that same restraint away entirely, a mirror held up uncomfortably close to everything the Bene Gesserit had always believed made them different, and better than the raw, unchecked power they might otherwise have chosen to become. There is a particular courage required to keep your own principles intact while genuinely, mortally afraid, and this history has tried, across the whole of this difficult chapter, to give the sisterhood full and honest credit for however imperfectly, however incompletely, they nonetheless managed to hold on to at least some meaningful version of that courage across the darkest years of a war. That offered them every reasonable excuse to simply let it go entirely. That they mostly succeeded, however imperfectly, says something genuinely worth remembering about the value of institutional discipline built patiently across centuries. A foundation strong enough to bend considerably under enormous pressure without ever quite breaking entirely. Individual sisters who served through the war's darkest years later described, in the rare accounts that survive, a particular kind of exhaustion that went beyond ordinary physical or even psychological fatigue. A slow erosion of the certainty that had once made sisterhood service feel coherent and purposeful. What allowed most of them to continue regardless, according to these same accounts, was rarely any single renewed conviction, but rather the simple, accumulated weight of each other. Sisters who had trained together, tested together, and now endured together, finding in that shared endurance a kind of stability no individual philosophy alone could have reliably provided. What ultimately carried the sisterhood through this period, more than any single strategic decision made at the highest levels of its leadership, was the accumulated, unglamorous reliability of thousands of individual sisters continuing their own daily work without pause, training students, advising households, tending the sick. Each small act of ordinary continuity, a quiet act of resistance against a conflict that seemed determined to make such ordinary continuity impossible. Up next in Chapter 19, Becoming Something New, we'll uncover how the sisterhood's own identity and own methods continued transforming under the enormous pressure of this unprecedented, ongoing conflict. The enormous pressure of their extended war against the honored maîtres pushed the Bene Gesserit sisterhood toward genuine, considerable transformation in both their practical methods and their own broader institutional identity, a change extending well beyond the specific tactical adaptations this history examined in the previous chapter. Mother Superior Odrada's own leadership exemplified this broader shift, her willingness to break with established sisterhood tradition when circumstances genuinely demanded it, representing a departure from the more cautious, more conservative institutional culture that had generally characterized Bene Gesserit leadership across most of their prior, considerably calmer centuries of institutional history. The careful, uneasy incorporation of certain honored maître techniques into Bene Gesserit training, pursued reluctantly and only after considerable internal debate regarding the genuine risk of corrupting sisterhood discipline through adopting methods their own traditional ethical framework had always considered genuinely unacceptable. illustrates just how far the sisterhood was willing to compromise long-held principle in service of institutional survival against a threat that showed no comparable willingness to extend the same ethical restraint the sisterhood itself continued, even under enormous pressure, working to preserve within their own evolving practice. Sheena's own remarkable, apparently innate connection to sandworms, discovered and carefully cultivated during this same difficult period, offered the sisterhood a genuinely unexpected asset in their broader survival strategy. Her unprecedented capability suggesting some lingering genetic echo of Leto II's own transformed nature persisting within the wider human population in ways the sisterhood's own careful genetic study had never previously anticipated or specifically identified, a discovery that considerably informed their ambitious project of transforming Chapter House into a new, sustainable desert world. Duncan Idaho's own continued presence within sisterhood affairs throughout this period, his relationship with Odrade growing into something considerably more personal and considerably more complicated than a simple working alliance, illustrates another dimension of the broader institutional transformation this difficult war forced upon the sisterhood, a willingness to form genuine, sustained partnership with outside allies in ways their more traditionally guarded, more traditionally self-contained institutional culture had rarely permitted across most of their prior long history. This period of forced transformation left the sisterhood, by the time Frank Herbert's own written account reaches its deliberately unresolved conclusion, as something genuinely different from the careful, patient, largely hidden institution this history traced across its earlier chapters. An order still recognizably Bene Gesserit in its fundamental discipline and fundamental purpose, but considerably more willing to adapt, to compromise, and to form genuine alliance than the sisterhood's own earlier centuries of careful, largely solitary institutional planning had ever previously required or ever previously permitted. Whether this transformation ultimately represented a genuine evolution suited to unprecedented circumstances, or a troubling erosion of the careful ethical discipline that had always distinguished the sisterhood from simple manipulation and simple exploitation of human vulnerability, remains a question this history leaves appropriately open, consistent with the genuinely unresolved conclusion Frank Herbert's own six-novel account of this remarkable order's long history ultimately arrives at. The specific internal sisterhood debate surrounding how far to actually go in adopting honored matra technique reveals genuine, ongoing tension within the order's own leadership during this transformative period, some senior Reverend Mothers arguing that survival justified whatever adaptation proved practically necessary. Others maintaining that a sisterhood willing to fully abandon its founding ethical restraint would have already lost the deeper institutional identity worth actually preserving, regardless of whether their physical survival as an organization ultimately succeeded or failed against the honored matre threat. This unresolved tension, still genuinely present within sisterhood internal culture by the time Frank Herbert's own account of this long history reaches its deliberately open conclusion, offers this history one final, important reminder that the Bene Gesserit sisterhood never achieved anything resembling simple, settled institutional consensus, even regarding questions as fundamental as their own core ethical identity, remaining instead a genuinely complex, genuinely internally debated order across the whole of their remarkable, centuries-spanning history. Chapter House's own gradual transformation into a new desert world, discussed in fuller technical detail within this history's companion account of the complete Dune saga, represented perhaps the clearest single symbol of just how far the sisterhood was willing to go in reshaping even their own most fundamental institutional circumstances, sacrificing centuries of established infrastructure on their own secret home world in pursuit of survival against a threat that had already proven willing to destroy anything standing between it and total, uncontested dominance. Shiana's own unprecedented role within this transformed sisterhood culture, a young woman whose natural connection to sandworms placed her outside the sisterhood's traditional hierarchy of earned capability, even as her contribution proved genuinely essential to their survival strategy, illustrated just how thoroughly circumstances had forced the Order to reconsider even their own most basic assumptions about where genuine value and genuine capability might actually be found. Still recognizably themselves, and yet no longer quite the same Order that had once, so long ago, trained a frightened young girl to master her own trembling hands. This is, perhaps, the truest measure of any institution genuinely worth studying carefully across a long history like this one. Not whether it remained perfectly, permanently consistent, but how honestly and how thoughtfully it responded when circumstances finally demanded genuine change. And the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, whatever else can fairly be said about their centuries of careful, sometimes troubling calculation, met that particular test with a seriousness this history has tried to honor fairly across the whole of tonight's long telling. Institutions, like people, rarely get to choose the circumstances that finally force them to grow, and the sisterhood's own growth during this desperate period came, as growth so often does, from genuine necessity rather than any comfortable, carefully planned evolution they might otherwise have preferred to undertake at their own patient pace. There is a particular kind of hope worth taking from watching an institution this old still capable of genuine, difficult self-examination, still willing to ask hard questions about its own conduct, even in the middle of a war that would have offered nearly any other organization ample excuse to simply stop asking and start surviving by whatever means proved necessary. That capacity for honest self-questioning, sustained even under the most extreme possible pressure, may well be the single quality this history has found most consistently worth admiring across the whole of the sisterhood's long, complicated, genuinely remarkable existence. This willingness to question their own foundational assumptions, rather than simply defending them more forcefully as pressure increased, distinguished the sisterhood from a great many other institutions across the Imperium's long history that faced comparably existential threats and chose, instead, to retreat further into rigid certainty precisely when circumstances most urgently called for genuine reconsideration. Several surviving internal records from this period show senior Reverend Mothers explicitly debating whether entire categories of long-held sisterhood practice still served their original purpose, debates conducted with a candor that would have seemed almost unthinkable during the Order's earlier, more settled centuries. This period of sustained institutional self-examination left a visible mark on sisterhood practice for generations afterward, evident in a subtly increased willingness among later Reverend Mothers to revisit and, when genuinely warranted, revise even long-settled sisterhood doctrine rather than treating it as permanently beyond question. Up next in Chapter 20, not witches, but something else entirely, we'll close this long history by naming, as clearly as we can, exactly what the Bene Gesserit sisterhood actually was. Having traced the Bene Gesserit sisterhood's full history across the whole of this long telling tonight, from the disciplined training of a young girl's earliest years to the desperate, transformative war against the honored matres that closes Frank Herbert's own written account, we can now name, with genuine clarity, exactly what this remarkable order actually was. Not witches. Whatever frightened outsiders across countless worlds and countless centuries chose to call them. Something considerably more patient, considerably more disciplined, and considerably more genuinely human than that simple, fearful word could ever hope to properly describe. The Bene Gesserit were, first and fundamentally, an institution built entirely on earned capability rather than granted power. Every uncanny skill that generated their fearsome reputation traceable back to years of documented, disciplined training available, at least in principle, to anyone with the willingness and the capacity to complete their extraordinarily demanding education. The voice, the truth reading, the total physical mastery of Prana Bindu, all of it rested on applied human physiology and applied human psychology, refined across centuries of careful study rather than granted through any mystical source beyond ordinary human effort and ordinary human patience extended across an extraordinarily long institutional timescale. They were, second, a genuinely sophisticated political and scientific institution, pursuing genetic and religious projects of a scale and a patience that few other organizations across the whole of recorded human history have ever attempted to sustain. The Missionaria Protectiva and the Breeding Index representing extraordinary achievements in applied social and genetic engineering. However genuinely troubling the ethical dimensions of manipulating entire populations' religious belief and entire bloodlines' reproductive choices ultimately proved to be when examined honestly, as this history has tried to examine them across the chapters gathered together tonight. They were, third, an institution capable of genuine error, genuine miscalculation, and genuine institutional humility when circumstances demanded it. Their careful centuries-long Kwisatz Haderach project, disrupted by a single woman's personal choice made from love rather than obedience. Their own careful methods proving genuinely insufficient against both Paul's unprecedented rise and, centuries later, the existential threat the honored matres eventually posed to their continued survival. This capacity for genuine miscalculation and genuine adaptation in response to it marks the sisterhood as something considerably more recognizably, fallibly human than the word witch, with its implication of unchallengeable supernatural mastery, could ever accurately capture. Perhaps most importantly, they were an institution built by women, for purposes both genuinely admirable and genuinely troubling in their willingness to subordinate individual human choice to larger, longer-term institutional purpose. A complexity this history has tried to honor honestly, rather than simplifying into either uncomplicated heroism or uncomplicated villainy. The true Bene Gesserit story, traced carefully across this long telling tonight, offers something considerably more interesting than any simple witch legend ever could. A genuine, detailed portrait of what extraordinary human discipline, sustained patiently across centuries, might actually accomplish, and what it might actually cost the individual women who gave their entire lives to sustaining it. As this long history finally draws to its close, consider one last time the word that started us on this journey tonight, witch, and how completely it fails to capture the patient, disciplined, genuinely human institution we have spent these 20 chapters together carefully uncovering. What the Bene Gesserit actually were was something far more remarkable than magic could ever be. Ordinary women, transformed through extraordinary effort into something the rest of the Imperium simply lacked the patience or the courage to ever fully understand. Consider, in these final quiet moments, how many other institutions across the whole of human history have been dismissed with a single, easy word simply because their actual methods remained genuinely difficult for outsiders to observe or to explain. And how often the truth beneath such dismissals turns out, on careful examination, to be considerably more interesting, considerably more human, and considerably more worth understanding than the frightened shorthand ever allowed. The Bene Gesserit spent centuries being called witches by people who never once troubled themselves to ask what actually lay beneath the word. Tonight, at least, we asked, let that be enough for now. This quiet, careful unraveling of an old and stubborn misunderstanding, carried gently alongside you as you finally drift toward sleep. Somewhere, still, in the vast unfolding history this account has only begun to trace, disciplined women continue their long, patient work, unseen and mostly unthanked, exactly as they always have. Let their story rest now, quietly, alongside your own thoughts, as sleep finally, gently arrives. There is a particular comfort worth carrying forward from a story like this one, told slowly at the edge of sleep, the reminder that extraordinary things are so often built not from any single dramatic moment, but from thousands of small, unremarkable days of patient, careful practice, repeated quietly, faithfully, for as long as it takes. Rest now, and let the last of this long, careful history dissolve gently into whatever comes next. You have done nothing but listen tonight, and that, quietly, was more than enough. Somewhere, still, women continue that same patient work, unseen, uncelebrated, simply, faithfully carrying it forward, exactly as they always have, exactly as they always will. If nothing else survives from tonight's long telling, let this much remain, that discipline patiently practiced, fear honestly faced, and knowledge carefully carried forward across generations of careful women can accomplish things no single dramatic gift ever could on its own. A quiet lesson worth carrying with you long after this particular history has faded, exactly as sleep itself now gently arrives. Nothing in this long telling was meant to flatten the sisterhood into either heroes or villains, since neither label ever quite fit an institution built from centuries of careful, sometimes admirable, sometimes deeply uncomfortable choices made by ordinary women doing extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily patient work, generation after generation, long before any of them could have known how the story would eventually turn out, or whether anyone, centuries later, would ever think to tell it gently, honestly, at the quiet close of someone else's long day. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story, though the true, full shape of what the sisterhood actually built stretches far beyond anything a single telling could ever fully hold. Tonight we named the word witch for exactly the misunderstanding it always was, and followed girls taken young into an order that shaped them completely. We learned the total mastery of prana bindu, and the voice that could bend another person's will without ever raising a hand. We watched truth read plainly in a trembling pulse, and fear faced down through a litany older than any single sister who ever spoke it. We traced the missionaria protectiva across 1,000 seeded worlds, and the long, patient breeding index guiding bloodlines across centuries. We lived through the Reverend Mother's ordeal and the flood of other memory that followed it. We named the Kwisatz Haderach project for what it truly was, and watched Jessica's quiet disobedience unravel it. We followed the sisterhood's long game with House Atreides, and Gaius Helen Mohiam's needle held steady against a frightened boy's neck. We named exactly what the sisterhood feared in Paul once he finally arrived, and watched them adapt, painfully, in the long years after his jihad. We stood beside them in their desperate war against the honored mattress, and watched them become something new entirely, something the word witch was never able to properly describe at all. There is nothing left now that you must carry. Let each of these old, patient names sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. None of this can touch you, and nothing here asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this long history carried you toward rest, stay with us, and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.